It began with the words etched in fear across my brother Daniel's last message to me. "David, I've found it. The entrance to the other world. I'm going in." My brother had always been obsessed with the paranormal. We grew up listening to his stories of ghostly encounters, reading books on unexplained phenomena, and watching countless horror movies. His bedroom was a museum of the bizarre, filled with everything from Ouija boards to antique seance equipment. I never truly believed in the supernatural, but for Daniel, it was a way of life. But then, 2 weeks ago, he went missing. Daniel had been on one of his excursions into the unknown, searching for evidence of the paranormal in an old forest that locals had dubbed the Cursed Forest. This place had a dark history, filled with legends of spirits and strange occurrences. The townsfolk steered clear of it, and the local authorities refused to enter its tangled depths. When his last message arrived, my heart sank. I knew he had discovered something he couldn't resist, something that had lured him into the heart of that cursed forest. I couldn't ignore it, I couldn't let my brother vanish without trying to find him. So, I gathered a group of his closest friends, people who shared his passion for the unexplained. Sarah, his ex-girlfriend who never quite got over him, Mark, his best friend since childhood, and Lisa, who shared Daniel's fascination with the supernatural. Together, we set off to find my brother, to venture into the cursed forest. As we arrived at the outskirts of the forest, I could feel an oppressive atmosphere settling around us. The air grew thick, and the sunlight dimmed. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens. Mark, who had a sense of direction that rivaled a GPS, took the lead with a map of the forest in hand. We walked the path my brother had walked. The first day was uneventful, but as night fell, an eerie feeling settled in. The forest came alive with unsettling sounds, whispers on the wind, faint cries that echoed in the distance, and rustling in the underbrush. We set up camp under the looming trees, the crackling fire offering the only solace in the encroaching darkness. Sarah, ever the skeptic, brushed off the unsettling sounds as mere animals. But I saw the doubt in her eyes. The second day was when things began to change. As Mark unfolded the map to chart our course, he froze, a furrow forming between his brows. He pointed to a path that was distinctly absent from the map. "How is this possible?" Mark muttered, his voice shaky. Lisa laughed nervously, "Maybe it's a shortcut. A hidden trail." We decided to follow the mysterious path. After all, finding Daniel was our top priority, and this might be a sign that we were on the right track. But as we ventured further, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was toying with us. Hours passed, and we should have reached a clearing by now, according to the map. Instead, the forest remained dense and unyielding. The path seemed to twist and turn, leading us deeper into a labyrinth of towering trees. The forest was changing around us. Paths on the map disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the ancient woods, while new, uncharted trails appeared like scars on the landscape. Panic simmered beneath the surface, but we pressed on, driven by the need to find Daniel. As the days turned into nights, we became disoriented, our sense of time slipping away. We were caught in a never-ending loop of trees and shadows, the forest toying with us, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. Then, on the fourth day, disaster struck. Sarah fell ill, her skin growing pale, and she trembled uncontrollably. We had no choice but to set up camp, our tent surrounded by the ominous trees. Sarah's condition worsened, and her fevered murmurs took on a disturbing quality. She spoke of paths that led to nowhere and of a presence that watched us from the shadows. It was as if the very forest had infected her with its malevolence. With no signal on our phones, we couldn't call for help. We were isolated, trapped in this cursed place with no way out. Desperation gnawed at us as we searched for any sign of escape. And then, as dawn broke on the 5th day, Sarah's illness took a sinister turn. She spoke in a voice that was not her own, a guttural, inhuman growl. Her eyes turned black, devoid of any trace of humanity. Suddenly, Sarah began running through the dense trees, and our group hurriedly followed her. She moved with an eerie determination, as if guided by some unseen force. The twisted forest seemed to part before her, revealing a hidden path that led us deeper into its depths. As we continued our chase, we stumbled upon an eerie, dilapidated building that seemed completely out of place in the heart of the cursed forest. The structure was made of decaying wood and overgrown with moss, its windows shattered and its roof sagging under the weight of time. Without hesitation, we entered the forsaken building, drawn by an inexplicable force that seemed to guide our every step. The air inside was heavy with a palpable sense of dread, and the dim light filtering through the broken windows cast long, menacing shadows. And there, in a room that felt like the epicenter of this malevolent place, we found my brother Daniel. He was pale, his eyes wide with terror, and he huddled in the corner of the room, his arms wrapped tightly around his trembling form. Dirt and grime covered his clothes, and his hair was matted with sweat. "Daniel!" I cried out, rushing to his side. "We've been searching for you. Are you okay?" His gaze shifted slowly from the dark corner of the room to me, and when he spoke, his voice quivered with a haunting intensity. "You shouldn't have come here, David. None of you should be here." My heart sank as I realized that something was horribly wrong. This wasn't the brother I knew. His obsession with the paranormal had led him into this nightmare, and whatever he had encountered had changed him. Sarah, Mark, and Lisa watched in stunned silence, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and confusion. "We're getting you out of here," I said firmly, reaching for Daniel's trembling hand. But as I touched him, a chilling realization washed over me. He was ice-cold, as if he had been drained of all warmth. And then, from the shadows of the room, a sinister whisper emerged, a voice that was not my brother's. "You can't leave. None of you can." Before I could react, the room plunged into darkness, and an otherworldly scream echoed through the air. Panic set in, and I fumbled for a flashlight, illuminating the room in a stark, harsh beam of light. But what I saw sent a shiver down my spine that I would never forget. My brother Daniel was no longer huddled in the corner. Instead, he now stood at the center of a grotesque tableau, his body contorted and suspended in mid-air, as if held by invisible hands. Around him, the walls of the room were adorned with eerie symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse with a malevolent energy. The very essence of the cursed forest seemed to converge upon this nightmarish scene. "Daniel, please!" I cried out, my voice quaking with terror. "Snap out of it. You're stronger than this." But my brother's response was not his own. It was the same guttural, inhuman growl that had emanated from Sarah when she succumbed to the forest's malevolence. It was a voice that carried the weight of ancient malevolence, and it sent shivers down our spines. Mark, Lisa, and Sarah huddled close together, their faces etched with terror and disbelief. This was beyond anything we had ever imagined, beyond the realms of science or reason. The cursed forest had ensnared us in its sinister web, and my brother had become a conduit for its malevolent power. "We have to break the connection," Mark shouted, his voice trembling but determined. As we stood there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, an idea began to form in the back of my mind. It was a desperate and dangerous plan, but it was the only option we had left. If we didn't act quickly, my brother and, potentially, all of us would be lost to the cursed forest forever. With newfound determination, I turned to my friends, my voice unwavering despite the terror that coursed through my veins. We need to disrupt these symbols. They're the source of the forest's power. Mark, Lisa, and Sarah nodded in reluctant agreement, their faces pale with fear. We knew that we had to act quickly, but the room felt like a trap, and the symbols seemed to react to our every movement. We approached the nearest wall, our trembling hands reaching out to deface the symbols. As we scratched and broke the wooden walls, Danny jumped on Mark's back and bit off his ear. After Mark was knocked down, Daniel attacked me and started choking me with inhuman strength. A cacophony of unearthly screams and growls filled the air, drowning out our frantic efforts. It was as if the forest fought back, unleashing its malevolent power to protect the symbols that bound my brother and this nightmarish place together. And then, just as we thought we could go no further, a blinding flash of light erupted from the symbols, accompanied by a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was a climax of malevolence, a final, desperate attempt by the forest to maintain its grip on us. But as the light faded and the room returned to an eerie stillness, we knew that something had changed. The symbols, once pulsing with dark energy, had lost their malevolent glow. My brother Daniel came to himself. "David," he whispered, his voice weak and uncertain. "Yes, it's me," I replied, relief washing over me. "We're getting out of here, all of us." The horrors we had witnessed would haunt us for the rest of our lives, a testament to the darkness that lurked within the heart of the cursed forest. And as we ventured back into the world we knew, forever changed by our ordeal, we vowed never to speak of what had truly happened in that nightmarish place. For some secrets were best left buried, and some forests were best left unexplored, lest they claimed the souls of those who dared to enter.
The sterile hospital room felt eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had landed me here. My name is Emily, and the events leading to my hospitalization had been traumatic, to say the least. I'd suffered a severe car accident, leaving me with a broken leg and a host of other injuries. The pain was excruciating, but I was thankful to be alive. The first night in the hospital passed in a haze of painkillers and fragmented sleep. I was grateful for the peace and quiet, even though the antiseptic smell made my stomach churn. However, that tranquility was short-lived. The next morning, I awoke to a nurse bustling around my room. She was adjusting machines and replacing 4 bags, her expression tense. "Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice hoarse from disuse. The nurse turned to me, her face a mix of concern and sympathy. "We have another patient who needs a room, Emily," she explained. "I'm afraid we'll have to move you to a shared space for now." I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment at losing my private room. Pain shot up my leg as I shifted, but I gritted my teeth and allowed the nurse to help me into a wheelchair. She wheeled me down the corridor, past rows of identical rooms, until we arrived at my new shared room. The room was smaller than the one I'd had before, with 2 narrow beds separated by a flimsy curtain. I glanced at the other bed, wondering who my new roommate would be. But I couldn't have anticipated the terror that awaited me. A woman lay in the adjacent bed, her body still and her eyes vacant. She looked to be in her late 30s, with long, matted hair and an ashen complexion. Tubes and wires snaked from her frail form to various machines, monitoring her vitals. As the nurse helped me into my bed, she spoke softly. "This is Sarah. She's been diagnosed with schizophrenia. She might be a bit unpredictable. Just let us know if you need anything." I nodded, trying to be understanding. Mental illness was nothing to be afraid of, I told myself. But as night fell, and the room grew dark save for the dim glow of monitors, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled over me. I was awakened from a sleep by a soft, raspy whisper. My eyes flicked open, and I saw Sarah sitting up in her bed, her gaze locked onto me. She was muttering something under her breath, words that I couldn't quite make out. "Sarah?" I called out tentatively, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The whispering grew louder, more coherent, and I could finally discern the words. It was a language I didn't recognize, guttural and filled with malice. Fear clenched my heart as Sarah's body contorted in ways that should have been impossible. Her limbs twisted and bent at unnatural angles, her voice now a horrifying shriek that echoed through the room. I reached for the nurse call button, my trembling fingers missing it the first few times. When I finally pressed it, the nurse arrived quickly, her face a mask of concern. But as soon as she entered the room, Sarah's body seemed to relax, her eyes returning to their vacant state. "What happened?" the nurse asked, her eyes darting between us. I tried to explain, but the words stumbled out incoherently. I wasn't even sure if I believed what I had just witnessed. It was as if Sarah had been possessed by some malevolent force. The nurse gave me a skeptical look but reassured me that Sarah's condition was well documented. She left, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room once more. I watched Sarah warily, unable to shake the feeling that something sinister lurked beneath her fragile facade. Later that night, while I was half asleep, the laughter sliced through the silence of the room, eerie and chilling. I bolted awake, my eyes wide with terror, and my gaze landed on Sarah. She was sitting up in her bed, her head thrown back in a grotesque parody of joy as that sinister laugh emanated from her. My heart was pounding. I tried to get out of bed, but my broken leg protested with fiery pain. I could only watch in mounting horror as her laughter reached a crescendo, filling the room with a malevolent presence that seemed to smother the very air. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. Sarah's head snapped to me, her blank eyes locked on mine. A chill crawled down my spine as a slow, sinister smile spread across her face. It was a smile devoid of warmth, a smile that sent shivers down my spine. Before I could react, Sarah lunged at me with a speed and strength that defied her frail appearance. Her hands closed around my throat, squeezing with an unnatural force. I gasped for breath, as panic clawed at my mind. With a surge of adrenaline, I tried to break free from her grip. But Sarah's grip was unrelenting, her fingers like steel cables as they tightened around my throat. My vision dimmed, and I felt the edges of consciousness slipping away. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, the room was flooded with light as the nurse burst in. With a cry of alarm, she rushed forward and wrenched Sarah away from me. Sarah fought against her, her vacant eyes now filled with a frenzied rage. The struggle was brief but intense, and the nurse managed to subdue Sarah with the help of another nurse who had rushed in. They restrained her in her bed, securing her wrists and ankles with thick straps. I lay gasping for breath, my throat raw and bruised, my mind reeling from the horrifying encounter. Sarah's transformation, her supernatural strength, and that malevolent smile haunted me. I knew that whatever had taken hold of her was something far more sinister than mere schizophrenia. The medical staff called in a psychiatrist, hoping to make sense of the inexplicable events that had unfolded. I was moved to a different room, one as far away from Sarah as possible, but the trauma of that night stayed with me. As I lay in my new room, trying to come to terms with the horrifying truth, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something beyond the realm of human understanding. Sarah was no longer just a patient suffering from mental illness. She had become a vessel for something ancient and malevolent, a force that defied explanation.
Moving into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town was meant to be nothing more than a scientific endeavor, a chance for me to debunk the irrational tales of ghosts and hauntings that had plagued the place for generations. As a seasoned scientist with a firm grip on reality, I scoffed at the notion of the supernatural. I was confident that my rational explanations would lay the foundation for a best-selling book that would debunk the age-old myths. The first night in the house was quiet, almost disappointingly so. The walls creaked, the floors groaned, but nothing that couldn't be attributed to the natural settling of an aging structure. I chuckled to myself, imagining how easily these mundane sounds could be mistaken for ghostly apparitions. I was ready to wrap up my investigation and return to the comforts of my own home. But the following nights were far from mundane. I awoke to the sound of whispering, faint voices that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. My heart raced as I followed the sound, my skepticism wavering for the first time. The voices grew louder as I approached the old attic, its door slightly ajar. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. What I saw defied all reason. An ethereal figure, a shimmering silhouette, stood before me. It was there for just an instant, then vanished as if it were never there. My breath caught in my throat, my scientific mind struggling to comprehend the inexplicable. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination? But the chill that clung to the air, the heaviness that settled in the room, defied rationalization. Determined to find answers, I set up an array of sensors and cameras throughout the house. The results were confounding: temperature drops, unexplained movements, strange fluctuations in electromagnetic fields. These were not the results I had expected. Yet, my training and years of rationality told me there must be an explanation. As the nights wore on, the phenomena grew more intense. Objects moved on their own, shadowy figures danced at the edge of my vision, and chilling whispers echoed in the corridors. I analyzed the data meticulously, attempting to attribute the occurrences to natural causes, drafts, faulty wiring, my own fatigue-induced hallucinations. But deep down, doubt began to creep in. One night, I decided to take a stroll through the house, relying on my flashlight to guide me. I noticed something unusual, an irregular pattern of muddy footprints leading toward the basement. I dismissed it as a possible intrusion by someone. I checked the cameras in the basement, which were mysteriously non-functional. Nervously, I descended into the basement, my flashlight flickering as I reached the bottom of the stairs. What I found sent shivers down my spine, a series of demonic symbols carved into the ground, etched with malevolent precision. Before I could fully process the implications, a shadow with crimson eyes emerged from the darkness. Panic surged through me as my flashlight abruptly died, plunging me into complete darkness. Heart pounding, I scrambled back up the stairs, but the cellar door had sealed itself shut. I pushed and pulled, but it wouldn't open, as if it were mocking my attempts to escape. Fear closed in around me. I was trapped, cut off from the world above, alone in a realm where the supernatural defied the rational. My skepticism was shattered, replaced by a stark and chilling reality that I could no longer deny. In a moment of desperation, I recalled seeing a hammer under the stairs during my previous explorations. Stumbling in the dark, I managed to feel the hammer. I swung at the old cellar door with all my might. The wood splintered, the sound echoing through the darkness. Adrenaline surged as I hit it again and again, until finally, the door gave way. Without looking back, I sprinted out of the house, my heart racing as I gasped for air. I didn't stop until I was far away from the menacing old house that had become a labyrinth of terror. The next morning, with trembling hands and a deep sense of unease, I returned to the house to gather my belongings. The weight of the experience still hung heavy in the air, a reminder that even the staunchest skepticism could crumble in the face of the unknown. With trembling hands, I consulted the local archives, tracing the history of the house back to its origins. What I uncovered was a tale of tragedy, of lives lost and spirits trapped in a liminal space. I read accounts of seances and rituals, of summonings and forbidden knowledge. The rational explanations I had sought were being replaced by a truth I could not deny: the supernatural was real. Bullying had always been a part of our high school culture, and I was no stranger to it. A group of us, led by my friends Jason, Mike, and Sarah, often targeted one particular boy named Ethan. He was an easy victim, quiet and introverted, the perfect target for our cruel jokes and taunts. One chilly October afternoon, as the leaves rustled with the promise of an impending Halloween, our torment of Ethan reached a sickening crescendo. We cornered him in the schoolyard, hurling insults and pushing him around. We didn't see him as a human being, just a source of entertainment. Little did we know that our actions would soon unleash a malevolent force that would forever change our lives. As the bullying reached its peak, an unfortunate accident occurred. Jason, in his twisted sense of humor, shoved Ethan too forcefully, causing him to stumble backward and collide with a metal railing. The sickening crunch of bone against steel silenced us all. Ethan fell to the ground, his body limp and unmoving. Panic washed over us as we realized the gravity of what had just transpired. We stared in horror at Ethan's lifeless form, knowing that our torment had led to this tragic accident. Fear gripped us as we contemplated the consequences of our actions. The guilt that gnawed at our conscience was suffocating. Paramedics arrived, but it was too late. Ethan was pronounced dead at the scene, his life snuffed out by our relentless cruelty. As we watched his body being taken away, a heavy sense of dread settled over us, a feeling that we had unleashed something beyond our control. In the days that followed, our guilt and remorse gnawed at us. We couldn't escape the shadows of that fateful afternoon. And then, inexplicable things began to happen. It started with faint, ghostly whispers in the hallways of the school. We'd hear our names whispered in eerie, chilling tones. Our textbooks would tumble to the floor seemingly of their own accord. Lockers would slam shut with a force that defied explanation. The nightmare had escalated far beyond anything we could have imagined. The torment we had inflicted upon Ethan, which had ultimately led to his tragic death, had unleashed a malevolent force that was now systematically hunting us down. Mike was the first to meet a gruesome end. It was a chilly autumn evening when he went missing. His family, desperate to find him, called the police. I remember joining the search party, my unease growing with every step through the darkened woods near Mike's house. As we ventured deeper into the forest, our flashlights casting feeble beams into the gloom, we stumbled upon a gruesome sight. Mike's lifeless body hung from a tree, his face contorted in a rictus of terror. The word "bully" had been carved into his chest with jagged, malevolent precision. Fear gripped our group, and we realized that our tormentor was not of this world. It sought retribution for the suffering we had inflicted upon Ethan. It hunted us down one by one, each of us paying for our cruelty in blood. Jason was the next to go, and his demise was even more gruesome. One night, as I lay in bed, haunted by guilt and fear, I received a call from him. His voice was trembling, panicked. He begged for my help, claiming that something was in his house, something not of this world. I could hear the terror in his voice, and it sent shivers down my spine. I rushed to Jason's house, my heart pounding with dread. As I entered his darkened home, I could feel a malevolent presence lurking in the shadows. The air was thick with an otherworldly chill, and I knew that we were not alone. I found Jason in his room, his eyes wide with terror as he muttered incoherently about a dark figure that had emerged from the shadows. And then, before my very eyes, the entity struck. It materialized as a grotesque, shadowy specter, its fingers like icy tendrils as it wrapped them around Jason's throat. I tried to intervene, to save my friend, but it was too late. With a sickening, bone-crushing snap, it ended Jason's life, his body falling limp and lifeless. The word bully appeared once more, etched into his flesh as a gruesome reminder of our sins. Sarah was the last of our group, and she had become a shell of her former self. The torment of witnessing the deaths of her friends had broken her spirit. She had become reclusive, locking herself in her room for days on end, plagued by nightmares and incessant whispering voices. One evening, I received a frantic call from her. She was sobbing, her words barely intelligible. She claimed that the malevolent force was in her room, that it was toying with her, tormenting her with the memories of what we had done to Ethan. I rushed to her house, my heart heavy with dread. When I reached the house, I saw her lifeless body falling from the window of her room. There was blood everywhere, her face was contorted with horror, and her arms and legs were twisted and broken. And now, as I write this, I know that I am next. The entity has shown me no mercy, tormenting me day and night with whispers and shadows. I can feel its icy fingers closing in on me, and I know that my time is running out. I am haunted not only by the malevolent entity but also by the guilt of what we did to Ethan. The paranormal events that have unfolded are a horrifying reminder that our actions have consequences, and some sins can never be forgiven. I write this as a warning to others, a cautionary tale of the darkness that can be unleashed by cruelty and bullying. I can only hope that my story serves as a reminder that our actions, no matter how seemingly insignificant, can have far-reaching and terrifying consequences. I had always prided myself on being a rational psychologist. My years of training and experience had taught me to dissect the complexities of the human mind, to find the logical explanations behind even the most bizarre behaviors. But all of that was about to be put to the test. It began with a phone call late one evening. Dr. Elizabeth Simmons, a colleague I deeply respected, was on the other end of the line. Her voice trembled as she explained the situation. "I need your help, Daniel," she said. "I have a patient here, a young woman named Emily, and I don't know what to make of it. Her behavior is beyond anything I've encountered." I listened intently as Elizabeth described the disturbing events that had unfolded over the past few weeks. Emily, a previously well-adjusted college student, had begun to exhibit erratic and increasingly violent behavior. She had attacked her roommates, spoken in languages she had no knowledge of, and shown an uncanny ability to predict future events with chilling accuracy. Elizabeth had conducted numerous psychiatric evaluations, searching for a rational explanation, but had found none. Emily's medical tests came back clean. She was physically healthy, yet her mental state continued to deteriorate. As Elizabeth spoke, I could hear the desperation in her voice. She was a true skeptic, much like myself, but she had reached a point where she could no longer dismiss the possibility of something beyond the realms of science. Reluctantly, I agreed to evaluate Emily. I had my reservations, believing that there must be a psychological explanation, perhaps a hidden trauma or mental illness that had eluded detection. Little did I know how profoundly this case would challenge my skepticism. When I arrived at the psychiatric facility where Emily was being held, I was struck by the eerie atmosphere that seemed to hang over the place. It was as if a palpable sense of dread permeated the very walls. As I entered the room where Emily was confined, her eyes locked onto mine, and I could see a flicker of malevolence in her gaze. We began the evaluation, and Emily's behavior grew increasingly unsettling. She spoke in voices that were not her own, alternating between languages I couldn't recognize and guttural, incomprehensible sounds. Her body contorted in unnatural ways, and she seemed to possess an otherworldly strength. I attempted to maintain my composure, chalking her behavior up to a severe psychological disorder. But then, Emily began to speak in a voice that sent chills down my spine. It was a voice filled with hatred and malice, a voice that claimed not to belong to Emily but to a malevolent entity that had taken possession of her. "I've been waiting for you, Daniel," the voice taunted. "You think you can analyze and diagnose me like all the others, but you're in for a surprise." I was taken aback, struggling to maintain my professional facade. This couldn't be real. It was a manifestation of Emily's fractured psyche, a grotesque coping mechanism. But as the evaluation continued, I witnessed phenomena that defied all explanation. Suddenly, one of the chairs in the room rose into the air. I froze, I couldn't believe my eyes. Emily's body contorted in ways that should have been impossible without breaking bones. Elizabeth, who had been observing the evaluation, looked at me with a mix of fear and uncertainty. She was seeing it too, and her skepticism was crumbling before our eyes. I decided to press further, to confront the entity within Emily. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice quivering. The entity laughed, a sinister sound that echoed through the room. "I am a shadow in the darkness, a whisper in the void. I have been with Emily since she was a child, waiting for the moment when I could reveal myself." Room grew colder and my breaths became shallow. I felt an oppressive force pressing against my chest, as if an invisible hand was suffocating me. Panic surged through me, and I struggled to maintain my composure. Emily's laughter, filled with eerie amusement, echoed through the room. Her eyes were fixed on me, but they were not the eyes of the young woman I had met earlier. They were cold, malevolent orbs that seemed to radiate darkness. In that desperate moment, when it felt like the shadows were closing in around me, the door burst open, and a priest entered the room. Father Michael, his face a mask of solemn determination, stepped forward with a crucifix in hand. His arrival was a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. Without hesitation, Father Michael began to recite the words of an exorcism, his voice unwavering and filled with unwavering faith. Emily's laughter turned into agonized screams as if an invisible force was waging a battle within her. The room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and I watched in astonishment as Emily's contorted body began to convulse and writhe. Her voice shifted between guttural growls and unearthly wails. As the exorcism continued, I could see a fierce struggle unfolding before my eyes, a battle between the malevolent entity and the unyielding faith of Father Michael. It was a battle that transcended the boundaries of my rational understanding, a confrontation with forces that defied explanation. Minutes passed like hours, and the room became a battleground of spiritual warfare. Finally, with a final, thunderous cry, Emily's body went limp, and her eyes cleared, revealing the terrified and confused young woman beneath. Father Michael lowered the crucifix, and the room seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. The malevolent entity had been vanquished, at least for the time being. I helped Emily to her feet, and she looked around, disoriented and shaken. She had no memory of the horrors she had endured during the possession. Her eyes met mine, and they were filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. As Father Michael offered a prayer of protection and purification over the room, I couldn't help but question the very foundations of my rationality. What I had witnessed went against everything I had been trained to believe, everything I had thought to be true. Elizabeth, her skepticism similarly shattered, approached me, and we exchanged a wordless acknowledgement of the inexplicable events we had just witnessed. The exorcism marked a turning point in my life. It forced me to confront the limits of human understanding and to acknowledge that there are forces in this world that defy all attempts at explanation. I had always prided myself on being a rational psychologist, but that night, I had come face to face with the unknown, and it had left an indelible mark on my soul. The cold wind cut through my jacket as I stood before the decaying facade of the old asylum. Its broken windows stared back at me like empty eye sockets, and the overcast sky cast a pallor over the already grim scene. My heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I wasn't alone. 5 of my friends, fellow urban explorers, were with me. We had heard whispers about this place, tales of its dark past and the tormented souls said to still linger within its crumbling walls. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, a relic of a time when the mentally ill were hidden away from society. It was a place of suffering, where the walls held the secrets of countless tormented souls. Now, it beckoned us, daring us to uncover its mysteries. Are we really doing this? Sarah's voice quivered as she clutched her camera. Her eyes, usually filled with excitement on our explorations, were clouded with unease. We've explored plenty of places before, Sarah, I reassured her, although I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in me. This is just another adventure. The group nodded, and with that unspoken agreement, we pushed open the creaking doors and stepped into the abyss. The air inside was thick with decay, and the stench of mildew assaulted our senses. We descended into a dimly lit corridor, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The walls seemed to close in around us, whispering secrets we couldn't quite make out. As we ventured deeper into the asylum, we began to hear faint, distant cries. At first, we dismissed them as the wind playing tricks on our ears. But the cries grew louder, more desperate, and impossible to ignore. They said this place was haunted, Mark muttered, his voice shaky. Nonsense, John scoffed. It's probably just animals or something. We pressed on, determined to unravel the asylum's mysteries. The cries seemed to follow us, echoing through the narrow corridors, reverberating off the peeling paint and crumbling plaster. Our flashlights illuminated rooms frozen in time. Rusty beds with tattered sheets, straitjackets hanging like eerie ornaments, and scribbled messages on the walls, testaments to the suffering that had occurred here. Visions of tormented souls danced at the edge of our perception, fleeting and indistinct. Sarah's camera continued to snap photos, capturing the decrepit remnants of the asylum's past. Each flash illuminated the rooms frozen in time, revealing more of the tragic history hidden within these walls. But as she took a picture of one particularly dark and foreboding room, a collective gasp escaped our lips. In the photo, amidst the peeling wallpaper and decaying furniture, there was something else, an eerie shadow that shouldn't have been there. It was not a trick of the light or a smudge on the lens. This shadow had form and substance, and it seemed to be reaching out, as if trying to escape the frame of the photograph. Sarah lowered her camera, her hands trembling. "Did you all see that?" she whispered, her voice quivering. We nodded, our eyes fixed on the photograph. The shadow defied explanation, and a feeling of dread settled over us. It was as if the asylum itself had manifested itself in that image, a silent scream frozen in time. As we continued to explore, the cries of the tormented grew more insistent, as if beckoning us deeper into the asylum's heart. With each step, the darkness seemed to press closer, and the shadows that danced on the walls took on sinister forms. It was then that we heard it, the sound of shuffling footsteps, distant but unmistakable. Panic surged through our veins, and we turned off our flashlights, plunging ourselves into darkness to hide from whatever might be approaching. In the inky blackness, we huddled together, our breaths shallow and rapid. The footsteps drew closer, growing louder with each passing moment. They echoed through the corridor, a haunting cadence that sent shivers down our spines. "Is anyone else in here with us?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. "But we need to stay quiet and still." We remained motionless, our senses heightened as we strained to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside our hiding place, and we held our breath, praying that whatever was out there would move on. Then, a voice, an agonized, mournful wail, pierced the silence. It was the cry of a tormented soul, a voice filled with despair and anguish. The sound was so close, so visceral, that it felt as if it reverberated inside our very bones. Terror washed over us, threatening to consume our sanity. We had come to explore, to satisfy our curiosity, but now we were trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. Sarah's camera, seemingly of its own volition, powered back on, its flash cutting through the darkness. In its brief illumination, we saw the source of the mournful cry, a figure, emaciated and hunched, its eyes vacant and empty, like a ghostly apparition from the past. Terror gripped our group as we stumbled out of the asylum, our frantic footsteps echoing in the night. The mournful cries still hung in the air, and the feeling of an oppressive darkness clung to us like a suffocating shroud. We had to get out, to escape the nightmarish horrors that lurked within those walls. As we reached the exit, a cold gust of wind welcomed us back into the open air. It felt like a reprieve, a return to the realm of the living. But our relief was short-lived as we realized that one of our friends, David, was missing. Panic surged anew, and without a second thought, we decided to re-enter the accursed building to find him. Our flashlights cut through the darkness as we called out his name, our voices trembling with fear. We ventured deeper into the asylum, retracing our steps to the room where we had last seen David. The eerie shadows played tricks on our senses, and the cries of the tormented seemed to intensify, as if mocking our desperate search. And then, there he was, standing in the center of the room, his back turned to us. He was whispering something in a language I couldn't recognize, a guttural, otherworldly chant that sent chills down my spine. "David?" Sarah's voice quivered as she approached him cautiously. Suddenly, as if in response to her call, David turned around to face us. His eyes were black voids, devoid of any humanity, and a malevolent grin twisted his features. Without warning, he lunged at us, his movements unnatural and inhuman. Panic and terror fueled our instincts, and we turned and ran as fast as our legs could carry us, leaving the nightmarish figure of our friend behind. We burst out of the asylum once more, our breathless sobs mixing with the frigid night air. The building seemed to emanate an aura of pure evil, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred into a realm of unspeakable horror. The following day, the police arrived to investigate David's disappearance. We recounted our harrowing experience, leading them to the room where we had last seen him. But when they entered, the room was empty, devoid of any trace of our missing friend. The police searched the entire asylum, but there was no sign of David. It was as if he had vanished without a trace, swallowed by the malevolent darkness that dwelled within those decaying walls. We were left with only our haunting memories and a chilling sense that we had escaped something far more sinister than we could ever comprehend. The asylum remained a place of unspeakable terror, a cursed relic of the past that would forever haunt our nightmares.
The night was growing darker, the only source of light in my home office emanating from the soft glow of my computer screen. I was used to working late into the night, it came with the territory of my demanding job. The rhythmic clatter of the keyboard was my only companion as I toiled away, engrossed in the virtual world on my monitor. The clock struck midnight, a reminder of how time had slipped away. With a yawn, I began winding down for the night. I'd just saved my work and was about to close my laptop when an incoming video call notification jolted me from my drowsiness. My pulse quickened as I stared at the caller's identity, unknown. Curiosity mingled with unease, and I hesitantly answered the call. The video feed revealed a familiar yet eerie sight. It was my own street, the view from my front yard. My confusion quickly turned to fear as the camera angle shifted, revealing my house. My trembling voice whispered, "Hello? Who's there?" There was no response at first, only the disconcerting sight of my own home. Then, a deep, distorted voice spoke, cold and menacing. "You don't know me, but I know you, Sarah." My heart raced. "What do you want?" A sinister chuckle emanated from the speaker. "I want to show you how vulnerable you are, Sarah. How defenseless you are in your own home." My mind swirled with fear and confusion. "Who are you?" The voice taunted me further. "I'm closer than you think." I quickly ended the call, my heart pounding in my chest as I rushed to check every door and window in my house. Fear gnawed at my sanity as I fumbled with locks and latches, my trembling hands barely able to function. The minutes dragged on like hours, and my paranoia escalated with each passing second. I locked myself in my bedroom, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. This couldn't be real, it had to be some kind of sick prank. But the fear that gripped me was all too real. As I huddled in the dimly lit room, my phone buzzed with another incoming call. Dread pulled in my stomach as I answered, and the screen displayed the unnerving sight of my own front door. It was the same masked figure from before, shrouded in darkness. My voice trembled as I managed to utter, "Why are you doing this?" The intruder's voice, now chillingly close, whispered, "I want you to understand, Sarah, how fragile your existence truly is." My breath caught in my throat as the camera angle shifted, revealing the door's lock. With a sinister smile, the intruder reached out and began to manipulate the lock from the outside. Panic surged through me as I realized the intruder was trying to gain entry to my home. I yelled, "Stay away from me!" A sickening click echoed through the room as the lock gave way, and the front door slowly creaked open. My heart raced as I saw the masked figure step over the threshold and into my home. I knew I had to act. I hung up and dialed 911, my voice trembling as I whispered my plea for help. But just as the call connected, the intruder's voice interrupted, his tone now dripping with malevolence. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sarah." Fear constricted my throat as the intruder spoke into the phone, revealing a chilling truth. He had somehow intercepted my 911 call. Panic surged as I hung up, realizing that the police wouldn't be able to reach me. Adrenaline surged through me, and I knew I had to escape. Without another thought, I rushed to the bedroom window and threw it open, my trembling hands grasping the windowsill. I had to jump, had to get away from this nightmarish intruder. With one final glance back, I leaped out of the window and landed with a painful thud in the yard below. Injured but alive, I barely got to my feet and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to get help, to escape the clutches of this relentless tormentor. As I sprinted down the street, my mind raced with questions. Who was this person? Why was he targeting me? My feet carried me to the nearest police station, a place that had always symbolized safety. The officers listened to my frantic account of the terrifying events, and together, we rushed back to my home, sirens wailing, my heart still pounding. I clung to the hope that the police would help me unravel this nightmare. But when we arrived, the very foundation of my reality crumbled. The door to my home was locked, as if nothing had happened. There were no signs of a break-in, no trace of the masked intruder who had tormented me just moments ago. Panic and frustration overwhelmed me as I realized the call history on my phone was missing. It was as if no one had called me, as if the entire nightmarish episode had been erased from existence. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, their eyes reflecting doubt and concern. One of them, a seasoned detective, approached me gently. "Miss, are you sure this is where it happened? There's no evidence of a break-in, and your call history is clean." Tears welled up in my eyes as I pleaded with them. "I swear, it happened. I saw that intruder, heard his voice, and my door was unlocked." The detective exchanged a look with his colleagues. They assured me they would investigate further, but their eyes betrayed their skepticism. To them, it appeared as though I was recounting a sinister nightmare rather than a real-life incident. As they left, I felt a suffocating sense of isolation. Had I imagined the entire ordeal? Was this some cruel manifestation of stress and paranoia? But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was all too real. Alone in my home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I locked every door and window, but the fear clung to me like a relentless shadow. The following days were filled with uneasiness. I constantly questioned my own sanity, wondering if I had truly experienced those horrifying events. But my fears were realized as the anonymous video calls began once again, each one more threatening than the last. The intruders seemed to revel in my fear, taunting me with their knowledge of my daily life. Despite my desperation, the police found no evidence to support my claims, and my friends and family began to distance themselves, believing I was suffering from a mental breakdown. I was trapped in a nightmare, alone and isolated, with no way to prove the terror that had consumed my life. I am currently writing this in a dimly lit room, my eyes constantly darting to the windows and doors, expecting the masked intruder to appear at any moment. My life has become a relentless cycle of fear, isolation, and paranoia. I'm no longer certain of what's real and what's imagined. Returning to my childhood home was never something I had anticipated. The house, perched on a quiet street, held memories both sweet and bitter. But now, with my mother ailing and in need of care, I found myself once again crossing the threshold of that old house, hoping to provide some comfort in her twilight years. The years had not been kind to the house. Its once vibrant paint had faded, and the garden, which my mother had lovingly tended to, now lay overgrown and neglected. My heart ached as I stepped through the front door, the echoes of my childhood laughter still haunting the air. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the mundane tasks of caregiving. I cleaned, cooked, and listened to my mother's stories of days gone by. But as the nights settled in, so did a strange sense of unease. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit living room, I saw a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned to find a young girl, no older than 10, standing in the doorway. She wore a dress from another era, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. My heart pounded as I blinked, convinced that I had imagined her. But the girl remained, her presence undeniable. She moved with a ghostly grace, her form translucent. I hesitated, my rational mind rejecting the idea that I was witnessing a ghost. It had to be a trick of the light, a product of my own exhaustion. The visions became more real with each passing night. The old house seemed to be transforming, its walls becoming permeable between the past and present. The apparitions that had once appeared distant and ephemeral grew stronger, more corporeal, and more terrifying. One night, as the moonlight filtered through the windows, I heard a series of unsettling knocks echoing through the corridors. My heart raced as I followed the sound, my steps hesitant but driven by a morbid curiosity. The knocking led me to the corridor, where the apparition of my mother stood. But she was not the woman I had known, her face contorted in anguish, her eyes filled with a vacant desperation. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her hit her head against the wall, over and over again. The sound was sickening, the thuds resonating with a bone-chilling intensity. I stumbled back, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrifying spectacle. And then, in a grotesque twist, her head turned 180 degrees, her eyes locking onto mine. Frozen in terror, I felt a primal urge to flee, to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before me. Without hesitation, I turned and sprinted back to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My heart pounded like a drum, sweat trickling down my forehead as I struggled to comprehend what I had just witnessed. Inside the safety of my room, I began to question my own sanity. The lines between reality and nightmare were blurring, and the past seemed to seep into the present with an eerie, malevolent force. I realized that the house itself was somehow feeding off the negative emotions that had taken root within its walls. My mother began to act strangely during the day, her demeanor shifting between moments of lucidity and confusion. She would gaze into the distance, her eyes filled with a haunted expression, as if she were reliving memories long buried. It was as though the house's unsettling atmosphere was affecting her, tugging at the threads of her own past. One afternoon, as I sat by her bedside, my mother's hand clenched mine with an unexpected strength. Her eyes, clouded with a mixture of fear and recognition, met mine. She began to speak in hushed, trembling tones, her voice a mere whisper. "I see them," she murmured, her voice quivering. "The shadows of the past, they walk these halls." My heart ached as I listened to her words. I could see the weight of her memories pressing down on her, her face etched with a mixture of sorrow and apprehension. I held her hand tighter, trying to offer whatever comfort I could. The days turned into weeks, and the house seemed to grow darker, its atmosphere more oppressive. I ventured into the attic, hoping to uncover any clues that might shed light on the history that had become so intertwined with the house's present. Among the dusty boxes and forgotten relics, I stumbled upon a collection of old letters and photographs, each piece a fragment of a story that had remained hidden for years. As I read through the letters, the pieces began to fall into place. The young girl I had seen in the doorway was not a mere apparition, she had been real, a friend from my mother's childhood. The photographs showed them playing together in the very rooms I now walked through. But the letters spoke of a tragedy, of an accident that had taken the young girl's life at the hands of my mother's negligence. Now, when her mother was weak and sick, the tormented spirit of the young girl who had once been her friend had returned for revenge. The weight of the past and the guilt that my mother carried seemed to have summoned this vengeful entity, a manifestation of the tragedy that had unfolded within these walls. Each night, the haunting grew more intense. The air in the house grew colder, and the atmosphere grew thick with an otherworldly presence. I could feel it, the anger, the pain, the thirst for retribution emanating from the shadows that danced along the walls. My mother's health deteriorated further, her frail form barely recognizable from the vibrant woman she had once been. I knew that the entity was tormenting her, reliving the trauma it had suffered and projecting it onto my mother. Desperation clawed at me. I couldn't bear to see my mother suffer like this, to be trapped in a cycle of guilt and fear that wasn't entirely her own. I knew I had to confront the spirit, to find a way to appease its anger and set both my mother and the girl's restless soul free. Research led me to a local historian who was familiar with the history of the house. The historian explained that the girl had fallen from a balcony due to a series of unfortunate events, her death a result of a tragic accident rather than my mother's negligence. But the guilt had consumed my mother, and that guilt had fueled the spirit's torment. Armed with this new understanding, I returned to the house, determined to face the spirit head-on. The atmosphere was suffocating, the energy thick with anger. I ventured into the corridor where my mother had once been tormented by the entity, and there it stood, the young girl, her form distorted with rage and grief. "I know the truth," I said, my voice steady but tinged with compassion. "I know what happened wasn't my mother's fault. She has suffered enough, and you have suffered enough. It's time to find peace." The girl's eyes bore into mine, her anger momentarily warring with a flicker of sadness. I held my ground, pouring all the empathy and understanding I could muster into my gaze. Slowly, the girl's form began to waver, the air around her shimmering. And then, with a heart-wrenching scream that echoed through the house, the spirit began to dissipate. The energy that had once radiated anger and vengeance grew faint, replaced by a sense of release and freedom. The weight that had held the house captive began to lift, the atmosphere growing lighter with every passing moment. In the days that followed, the house seemed to come back to life. The garden flourished, and the once faded paint regained its vibrancy. My mother's health improved, her demeanor changing from one of fear to one of acceptance. It was as if the house had finally found its peace, and in doing so, had granted my mother the same. As we prepared to leave, I looked back at the old house one last time. It was no longer a vessel of torment but a place that had witnessed both joy and sorrow. The past was no longer a prison, it had become a path to understanding and healing. My mother and I walked away, hand in hand, ready to embrace the future with newfound strength. I never thought a simple substitute teacher could turn my life into a living nightmare. His arrival seemed like any other, and the first weeks were as uneventful as one could imagine. His name was Mr. Harding, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a disarming smile. In the beginning, he was kind, helpful, and seemed genuinely concerned about my education. Little did I know, this was all just a sinister facade. The class had always been a mundane affair, but with Mr. Harding in charge, everything changed. He paid a disproportionate amount of attention to me, always hovering near my desk, offering help, and complimenting my work. It started innocently enough. He'd encourage me to answer questions, compliment my intelligence, and offer guidance on my assignments. As an introverted student who usually stayed in the background, this newfound attention seemed flattering at first. My friends noticed it too and would jokingly tease me about having an admirer. It all seemed innocent, even amusing at times. But then, the compliments started to take a darker turn. His words became laced with a twisted infatuation that made my skin crawl. "You're not like the others, Lily," he'd whisper, his voice oozing with an unsettling sweetness. "You're special, and I see great potential in you." At first, I tried to dismiss it, attributing his odd behavior to a misguided sense of mentorship. But as the weeks passed, the situation escalated. Mr. Harding began following me not only inside the school but even outside. He'd linger near my home, and I'd spot him in the most unexpected places. Fear and discomfort gnawed, and the amusement of my friends turned into concern. As the weeks passed, my anxiety grew into a constant, nagging fear. I began to lose sleep, my grades suffered, and the once enjoyable school atmosphere turned into a battleground of dread. One day I had to stay late at school. As I left, a heavy feeling of unease clung to me. The darkening sky cast long shadows, and the thought of running into Mr. Harding outside of school sent a shiver down my spine. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. I spotted him standing near the school gate, his eyes locked onto me. His friendly smile felt more like a predator's grin now, and a sense of dread overwhelmed me. I quickened my pace, but he caught up to me easily. "Lily," he said, his voice dripping with a false sweetness, "I'm going to drive you home. It's getting late." The idea of spending even a minute alone with this man terrified me, but he was persistent. He claimed it was for my safety and well-being, which sounded more like a threat than a promise. My friends had warned me about Mr. Harding's strange behavior, and now I couldn't ignore it any longer. I knew I shouldn't get into that car, but I felt cornered. In a moment of weakness, I agreed. As we drove, my heart pounded in my chest. I texted my friend, Alex, to let her know what was happening, hoping that having someone aware of the situation might help. Then, my phone buzzed with a text message from Alex. Her message sent a cold shock through my veins. She had done some research, and the man next to me was not Mr. Harding. He was an impersonator, a predator posing as a substitute teacher. Panic welled up inside me. What had I gotten myself into? The car continued to move through the dimly lit streets, and my mind raced. Who was this man, and what did he want with me? Fear gnawed at my insides as I realized I was in a dangerous situation, miles away from my friends and the safety of the school. As the car sped through unfamiliar streets, I soon realized that Mr. Harding wasn't taking me towards my home. Panic surged through my veins. I'd unwittingly fallen into a trap. My voice trembled as I questioned him, my heart pounding. "This isn't the way to my house, Mr. Harding. What are you doing?" His response sent shivers down my spine. "We just need to stop by my place for a moment. I forgot something I wanted to show you." The way he said it, that eerie sweetness in his voice, made my skin crawl. Alarm bells were blaring in my mind, but I felt trapped. The streets were deserted, and I had no idea where we were. Fear clawed at me, and I knew I needed to get out of this situation. "Mr. Harding, I really need to get home," I insisted. But he ignored my pleas, driving on towards his house. My anxiety grew with every passing mile. I knew I couldn't let him take me there. I fumbled for my phone and texted my friend Alex about the situation, letting her know that this was not the way to my home and that something was terribly wrong. As we pulled up to his house, Mr. Harding's demeanor grew even more unsettling. He extended an invitation for me to come inside, saying that it would only take a moment. Panic surged within me, and every instinct screamed that I should not step into that house. I refused his invitation. Enraged, Mr. Harding's sinister facade crumbled, and he turned violent. With a sudden and shocking burst of strength, he grabbed me, forcing me out of the car and dragging me towards his home. My screams filled the air, but there was no one around to hear. Inside, the horrors I had feared became all too real. He locked the door behind us, and I was trapped. It was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, a place of darkness and terror. However, unknown to me, Alex had sprung into action. She had taken my panicked text message seriously and immediately called the police, providing them with all the information she had. As I fought for my life inside Mr. Harding's house, the police were on their way. The police arrived just in time, sirens blaring and lights flashing, just as Mr. Harding's sinister intentions reached their peak. They stormed the house, rescuing me from the clutches of the madman. Mr. Harding was arrested, his true identity exposed. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I had narrowly escaped a horrible fate, thanks to the vigilance of a true friend and the swift response of the police. The ordeal left me forever changed, my once idyllic world now forever tainted by the sinister substitute teacher who had tried to lead me into darkness. My trust in appearances had been shattered, and I had learned the importance of staying vigilant, even when faced with seemingly harmless situations.
For me, its stark facade illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. My heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation as I stepped into the cold, sterile environment. I had been admitted for an unknown ailment that had left me weak and weary, confined to a hospital bed on the 3rd floor. Little did I know that my curiosity would lead me to the darkest depths of horror. It was during one of my restless nights that I first noticed the peculiarities. As I stood in front of the elevator, my gaze fell upon the button for the 4th floor. It was missing. Perhaps it was simply out of order, I reasoned, and dismissed the thought as the elevator doors slid open before me. The next day, my curiosity was reignited when I spotted chains padlocked around the stairs leading to the 4th floor. It was a stark contrast to the otherwise normal hospital environment. My interest in the paranormal had always been a source of fascination, and now, with the tantalizing mystery of the 4th floor, my curiosity consumed me. I decided to inquire about it during one of my conversations with the nurses. Nurse Johnson, a kind and soft-spoken woman, was assigned to my floor that evening. I approached her, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Nurse Johnson," I began, I couldn't help but notice that the 4th floor seems to be off-limits. "Why is that?" Nurse Johnson's expression flickered briefly, a shadow passing over her features. She hesitated before answering, her voice barely a whisper. "There are rumors, you know," she said, avoiding my gaze. "Rumors that the 4th floor is haunted. But I don't believe in such things." My mind raced with a flurry of emotions. Haunted? The idea both thrilled and unnerved me. I knew I shouldn't entertain such notions, but the allure of the unknown was too strong to resist. As the night settled in and the hospital grew quiet, I found myself unable to shake the thought of the 4th floor from my mind. Everyone around me was asleep, the halls dimly lit by the soft glow of the hallway lights. My heart pounded as I slipped out of my room and made my way to the chained stairwell leading to the forbidden floor. I stood before the chains, my heart in my throat, and carefully assessed the situation. The padlocked chains seemed formidable, an intimidating barrier between me and the mystery that lay above. But the weight of my curiosity propelled me forward. I ducked under the chains. My footsteps echoed through the silent corridor as I climbed, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, a creeping sensation of dread settling over me. What I encountered within sent a shockwave of terror through my very being. The 4th floor was a twisted, distorted version of the hospital I had known. The walls were covered in a sickly, decaying substance that oozed down. The air was heavy with an oppressive energy, a malevolence that seemed to seep into my very soul. My footsteps echoed as I ventured further into the nightmarish realm. Shadows danced along the walls, shapes that twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. Whispering voices filled the air, their words unintelligible yet dripping with malice. As I reached the end of the corridor, the voices intensified, their chilling words growing louder. Panic clawed at my chest, urging me to leave, but as I turned to escape, a scene of pure terror unfolded before me. A wheelchair stood in the middle of the corridor, blocking my path. My breath caught in my throat as the chair began to move, its wheels squeaking eerily against the floor. Heart pounding, I frantically looked for an escape route and dashed into the nearest room, slamming the door shut behind me. The room was dimly lit. And then I saw it, an unsettling human figure huddled in the corner, its eyes fixed on me. The figure emitted a shrill, inhuman screech that reverberated through the room. My heart raced, and every instinct screamed at me to flee. Rounding the wheelchair stopped in front of the door, I found myself back in the corridor, the figure still screeching behind me. I started running with all my might towards the exit. I burst back onto the third floor, my breath coming in panicked gasps. Nurse Johnson was waiting, her eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. I couldn't find the words to describe the horror I had witnessed. Instead, I simply shook my head, tears streaming down my face. Nurse Johnson helped me back to my room, her touch a comforting anchor in the midst of the terror that had consumed me. From that night on, I was haunted by the memories of the fourth floor. The hospital seemed to hold a sinister secret, a darkness that should have remained locked away. The moment we laid eyes on the historic mansion, with its towering turrets and ornate Victorian architecture, we knew we had found our dream home. The realtor regaled us with tales of the house's illustrious past, its former grandeur, and its remarkable history. It was to be our passion project, a restoration that would bring this forgotten beauty back to life. As we embarked on the renovations, our excitement was palpable. We eagerly rolled up our sleeves, ready to uncover the hidden gems beneath layers of dust and decay. The process was slow, painstaking, but as the weeks turned into months, we began to unearth more than just the house's architectural history. Strange anomalies became evident, walled-off sections that defied logical design, doorways leading to nowhere, and odd sounds that seemed to echo through the walls. One evening, while peeling back a particularly stubborn section of wallpaper, I revealed a concealed doorway, its edges time-worn. It was as if the house itself was guiding us to these hidden spaces. A sense of unease settled over me as I ventured beyond the threshold, my flashlight casting eerie shadows in the dim light. The hidden room was small and suffused with an inexplicable chill, even though the temperature outside was warm. Antique furniture lay abandoned, layers of dust covering once opulent fabrics. A portrait on the wall caught my attention, a stern-faced couple, their eyes seemingly following my every move. The unsettling feeling that we were being watched crept over me, and I hurriedly left the room, promising myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. As the renovations continued, more hidden rooms were uncovered, each one more unsettling than the last. In one, we discovered a collection of old journals and letters, revealing a twisted tale of jealousy, betrayal, and tragedy. The former owners' lives had been marred by darkness, a tale of obsession that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. One day, while my wife had gone to the local shop for some supplies, I found myself alone in the mansion. I was lost in thought, contemplating the history that seeped into every corner of the house, when I heard it, the faint sound of laughter. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, a product of the house's history playing tricks on my mind. But the laughter persisted, growing louder and more distinct. My curiosity got the best of me, and I followed the sound through the hallways, my heart quickening with each step. The laughter led me to the room with the stern-faced couple's portrait. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't quite explain. As I looked around, a sense of unease washed over me. Suddenly objects on the tables and shelves began to shake and rattle, as if moved by an invisible force. My rational mind struggled to understand what was happening. There had to be a logical explanation, a scientific reason behind it all. But then, without warning, a vase crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with tension. I didn't waste a moment. I fled from the room, my heart racing, and slammed the door behind me. After that incident, the activity inside the house escalated. Shadows moved of their own accord, whispering voices echoed through the corridors, and the air grew colder even in the midst of summer. My wife and I began to sleep fitfully, waking up to strange noises in the middle of the night, our dreams haunted by unsettling visions. One fateful evening, as we ventured into a newly discovered underground passage, we stumbled upon an eerie altar adorned with cryptic symbols and faded photographs. It was then that the truth became clear: the former owners had dabbled in the occult, their quest for power leading them down a path of darkness. And now, their restless spirits sought to consume us. As we raced to leave the passage, the air grew thick with an otherworldly energy. A blood-chilling shriek echoed through the corridor, and a shadowy figure with hollow eyes materialized before us. Panic surged as we ran, the walls closing in around us, and the passage seemed to stretch on endlessly. Just when all hope seemed lost, we burst into the open air. As we caught our breath, a chilling breeze swept through the open entrance of the passage. My eyes widened in terror as I saw a spectral, ethereal hand emerge from the darkness, its fingers stretching outwards. It was as if the malevolent entity was reaching out, grasping for anything it could get hold of. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I yanked my wife away just in time. We stumbled out of that cursed mansion, our breaths ragged, our hearts racing in terror. The darkness of the night surrounded us, but it was a welcome sight compared to the horrors we had witnessed within those haunted walls. We ran until our legs could carry us no more, until the mansion was nothing more than a sinister silhouette in the distance. We never returned to that mansion. It remained a grim reminder of the darkness that could fester within the most beautiful facades. Our dreams of restoration had turned into a nightmare of survival, and we were determined to move on, to put the horrors behind us. My name is John, and I was once a priest. But now, I'm a self-proclaimed atheist, a man who had turned his back on the faith he once held dear. Little did I know that my past would come back to haunt me in the most terrifying way possible. It all began when I received a desperate call late one evening. The voice on the other end was frantic, choked with fear and despair. It was the voice of Mark Thompson, an old friend from seminary who had also left the clergy. "John, you have to help us," Mark pleaded. "It's Isabella. She's not herself anymore." I could hear the tremor in Mark's voice, and it sent a shiver down my spine. He explained that his daughter, Isabella, had been acting strangely for weeks. She had become withdrawn, her once bright eyes now vacant and filled with a darkness that defied explanation. She spoke in tongues that were beyond any language known to man, and her body contorted in ways that were unnatural and horrifying. Mark and his wife, Susan, were devout believers, but their faith had done little to protect their family from the malevolent force that had taken hold of Isabella. They had sought help from priests and paranormal investigators, all to no avail. It seemed that their desperation had led them to me, a former priest turned non-believer. I hesitated, torn between my skepticism and the genuine fear in Mark's voice. I had left the priesthood after witnessing too many horrors that I could not reconcile with my faith. But now, faced with the terror that had gripped my friend's family, I couldn't turn my back on them. I arrived at the Thompsons' home, a stately old mansion that had seen better days. The air inside was heavy with a sense of foreboding, and the walls seemed to whisper with ancient secrets. As I entered the living room, Isabella sat there, a frail figure in the midst of an opulent setting, her eyes locking onto mine. Mark and Susan explained that they had already attempted an exorcism, but it had only made things worse. Isabella's voice, which had previously been a cacophony of guttural sounds, shifted to a chilling, otherworldly tone as I began to speak. "John," Isabella's voice hissed, "you cannot save them. You cannot save yourself. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pushed forward, determined to reason with whatever had taken hold of Isabella. I recited logical and psychological explanations for her behavior, attempting to expose the possession as a delusion. But then, the room seemed to tremble, and Isabella's eyes filled with a malevolent fire. The entity within her spoke again. You doubt the divine, John. You abandoned your faith, and now you will face the consequences. I could no longer deny the fact that something sinister had possessed this girl. I started the exorcism. The room had become a battleground of wills, with the malevolent entity within Isabella fighting tooth and nail against me. The objects in the room began to move as if possessed by a mind of their own. Books flew off the shelves, furniture slid across the floor, and the air grew heavy with a sense of dread. As I recited the prayers and incantations, Isabella's contorted body writhed and twisted, her eyes now a feral, unnatural shade. She lunged at me with inhuman strength, her hands clawing at my face. It took all of our combined efforts to restrain her and tie her to the bed. I pressed on, determined to banish the malevolent entity that had taken root in Isabella's soul. But with each passing moment, it became increasingly clear that this was no ordinary possession. The entity seemed to mock us, its laughter echoing through the room. Your lack of faith is your weakness, John, Isabella's voice taunted. You abandoned your calling, and now you will pay the price. I felt a deep sense of despair wash over me. I had become a non-believer, a man who had turned his back on the faith he had once held so dear. My skepticism had been my shield against the unexplained, but now it left me vulnerable in the face of the supernatural. The malevolent entity continued to resist, its power growing stronger with each passing moment. It hurled objects across the room, and the very walls seemed to close in on us. Isabella's laughter grew louder, more sinister, as if she reveled in our helplessness. It was then that I realized the only way to defeat this malevolent being was to confront my own disbelief, to find faith within myself once more. I closed my eyes, searching deep within, and began to recite the prayers not as a skeptic but as a man desperate to save a friend. As the words left my lips, a surge of energy filled the room. The malevolent entity screeched in agony, its hold on Isabella weakening. I continued to pray, pouring every ounce of faith and determination into the exorcism. Suddenly, the room fell still. The objects that had been in a frenzy of movement dropped to the floor, and Isabella's contorted body relaxed. Her eyes, once filled with darkness, were now clear and human. We had won. Isabella, exhausted and drained, looked at me with gratitude. The malevolent entity that had tormented her was gone, banished by the power of faith. As I left the Thompsons' home that day, I couldn't help but reflect on the ordeal I had just faced. I had been a non-believer, a man who had turned his back on the divine, but in that room, I had found something greater than skepticism. I had found the strength to confront the supernatural and emerge victorious. The malevolent entity had been banished, and Isabella was free from its grip. But I, the former priest turned atheist, had been forever changed. I had come face to face with the darkness that dwelled in the world, and I had discovered that sometimes, faith, even in the most unlikely of hearts, could be the greatest weapon against the unknown. The invitation from my dear friends, Richard and Elizabeth, to stay at their luxurious estate while they vacationed in Europe was both a surprise and an honor. They were a wealthy couple who often traveled, and they trusted me, a longtime friend, to oversee their opulent home in their absence. Little did I know that this stay would plunge me into a nightmarish world of secrets and terror. Upon their departure, Richard and Elizabeth had warned me that a relative of theirs would be arriving in a few days. They assured me that he was trustworthy and that his stay was only temporary. They insisted I make him comfortable and accommodate any requests he might have. I agreed, of course, knowing that this was a small favor to repay their kindness. As the sun sank below the horizon on the appointed day, their relative arrived. I welcomed him into the lavish home. His name was Victor, a tall and enigmatic man with piercing blue eyes and a demeanor that was polite but oddly distant. There was something about him that set me on edge, but I attributed it to my own imagination. The first evening Victor retired early to his guest suite, and I went about my business, enjoying the tranquility of the sprawling estate. But as the night deepened, strange occurrences began to unfold. I was awoken by a distant sound, a mournful wailing that echoed through the house like a ghostly lament. It was coming from Victor's room. I rushed to his door, my heart pounding, and knocked loudly. "Victor, are you all right?" The wailing abruptly ceased, and Victor's voice, strangely calm, responded, "I'm fine. Just a bad dream." Relieved but still unnerved, I returned to my room, but sleep eluded me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly amiss. Over the next few days, I noticed Victor's peculiar habits. He would spend hours locked in his room, and when he did emerge, his eyes were haunted, his hands trembling. I tried to engage him in conversation, but he deflected my questions with vague answers. One evening, as I passed his room, I heard him muttering in a language I couldn't understand. I decided to call Richard and tell him what was going on with Victor. My heart sank like a stone in my chest as I listened to Richard's voice on the other end of the line. His words were like a death knell, a confirmation of the growing dread that had been clawing at my mind. "Victor called me," Richard explained. "He said his trip has been unexpectedly delayed, and he won't be arriving for another week." "Did he let you know?" My voice quivered as I responded, "Richard, Victor is already here. He arrived as planned." There was a moment of silence, and then Richard's voice took on an edge of urgency. "That's not possible, he's with us in Europe." My blood ran cold as the truth struck me like a thunderbolt. The man who had been staying in the mansion with me was not Victor. He was an impostor, a stranger who had insinuated himself into this opulent estate under false pretenses. As I hung up the phone, panic surged within me. I realized that I was trapped in this sprawling mansion with a sinister stranger, a man who had fooled me into believing he was someone he wasn't. It was a nightmare come to life. I had to act swiftly. Every step, every sound, sent shivers down my spine as I formulated a plan to confront the impostor. I couldn't wait for Richard and Elizabeth to return from their vacation. The danger was present, and I was alone in this house. Carefully, I crept to the door of the impostor's guest suite. The dim light in the hallway cast eerie shadows. With determination, I turned the doorknob, creaking it open. The room was dark, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. The figure in the room had his back to me, and I decided it was time to confront him. My voice shook, but I managed to say, "I know you're not Victor. You need to leave." The room fell into an oppressive silence, and I could feel the tension in the air. Then, slowly, the impostor turned around to face me. But he was not the same person I had seen before. His eyes were no longer distant and calm. Instead, they glittered with malice. His grinning expression revealed teeth that seemed too sharp, too predatory. A shiver ran down my spine. Without a word, the impostor lunged at me, and we tumbled into a frenzied struggle on the ground. I fought with all my might, but he was relentless and overpowering. His grip was like a vice, and his laughter was a bone-chilling symphony that filled the room. I cried out as his teeth sank into my arm, blood spilling onto the floor. He didn't stop, his laughter growing more maniacal with each bite. I felt his teeth graze my leg, and a searing pain shot through me as if he intended to devour me alive. But just when I thought my end was near, a chorus of sirens wailed in the distance, drawing nearer with each passing moment. The police had arrived, alerted by Richard, who had acted swiftly upon my call. With a final, desperate push, I managed to disentangle myself from the crazed imposter and scrambled away. The police burst into the room, their weapons drawn and faces etched with determination. The imposter was apprehended, his laughter silenced as he was overwhelmed by the authorities. This guy was a psychopath who had broken into my friend's mansion under false pretenses and was finally exposed. In the days that followed, the mansion was combed for clues and evidence of his malevolent intent. Richard and Elizabeth returned from their vacation, grateful for my bravery, and the mansion was cleansed of the dark presence that had infiltrated it. But the nightmarish encounter with the imposter had left scars that would never fully heal. I had learned that darkness can lurk even in the most unexpected places, and that trust can be easily manipulated. My friend's kindness had almost led to tragedy, and the horrors of that night would forever linger in the shadows of my memory. The decision to renovate and reopen the old hotel came with the promise of a fresh start. My family had always dreamt of owning a charming, historic inn, and this neglected building seemed like the perfect opportunity. Little did we know that this dream would soon turn into a haunting nightmare. The hotel, named the Ravenswood Inn, had stood vacant for decades, its once grand facade now a weathered and crumbling testament to its former glory. Ivy clung to the cracked walls, and the windows were boarded up as if the building itself had been trying to hide its secrets from the world. The town had whispered stories about the Ravenswood Inn, tales of tragedy, mysterious disappearances, and a dark history that had caused its abrupt closure. But we were undeterred. With the optimism that comes with youth and ambition, we saw potential where others saw despair. As we stepped through the creaking double doors, the air inside was heavy with dust and the scent of decay. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the boarded windows, casting eerie patterns on the cracked floor tiles. The interior was a maze of narrow hallways and forgotten rooms, each filled with relics of a bygone era. Our first few days of renovation went smoothly. We cleared away the debris, peeled off layers of faded wallpaper, and started to breathe life back into the old place. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, we began to notice strange occurrences. Disembodied voices echoed through the empty hallways, whispers so faint that they sent shivers down our spines. We brushed them off as mere echoes of the past, the building settling into its new life. But then the lights started to flicker. They would dim when we entered a room and brighten when we left, as if someone, or something, was toying with us. One evening, while working in the lobby, I saw the antique grandfather clock against the wall begin to chime, its hands moving backward as if rewinding time. I called out to my family, but they were equally mystified by the strange happenings. As weeks turned into months, the occurrences escalated. Objects moved on their own, sliding across tables and chairs, shifting when no one was near. Tools vanished, only to reappear in bizarre places. Our once enthusiastic crew grew increasingly uneasy, some even refusing to return to the inn after sundown. One day I stayed late because there was a lot of work. I decided to sleep in the hotel. As I lay in my room, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Assuming it was a family member, I called out, but there was no response. The footsteps grew closer, the floorboards creaking with each careful step. I peered into the hallway, but no one was there. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and cautiously stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The old wooden floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I moved towards the spot where I had heard the footsteps. The hallway stretched before me, bathed in the eerie glow of the moonlight filtering through the boarded-up windows. The air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding hung heavy in the atmosphere. I aimed my flashlight down the corridor, its beam cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. I saw nothing at first, just the empty hallway and the closed doors to the other rooms. I hesitated, unsure of what I was looking for, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The shadows seemed to dance and writhe at the edges of my vision, as if concealing some unseen presence. Then, as I scanned the hallway once more, my flashlight flickered, casting a brief, disorienting darkness. In that split second of obscurity, I felt a presence rush past me, a frigid gust of air that sent a chill down my spine. I shivered, my breath visible in the cold air, and my heart raced as I struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the old building playing on my fears? Gathering my courage, I continued down the hallway, determined to discover the source of the strange footsteps. Suddenly the door of one of the rooms slammed. I was going to have a heart attack. I approached the door slowly. My heart raced as I swung open the door to the room, the anticipation of what I might find on the other side clawing at my insides. The scene that unfolded before me would haunt my nightmares for years to come. There, sitting by the window, was a ghostly figure of a woman. Her pale, translucent form seemed to flicker like a dying candle, and her eyes held an emptiness that sent shivers down my spine. Her gaze remained fixed on the desolate landscape beyond the window, as if she were eternally trapped in her own torment. "Leave," she whispered, her voice a mournful echo that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at her in disbelief. The air in the room grew colder, and I could feel a weight pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. Without warning, she pushed herself away from the window ledge and, with an ethereal grace, rose to her feet. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like a wraith from a forgotten nightmare. And then, in a moment of sheer horror, she threw herself out of the window. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding, expecting to see her lifeless body sprawled on the ground below. But to my bewilderment, there was nothing there, no body, no sign of her presence at all. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Confusion and fear swirled within me as I scanned the empty street below. There was no trace of the woman who had just moments ago occupied the room with her spectral presence. But as I turned, my heart froze in my chest. The ghostly figure of the woman was right behind me, her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and she was screaming, "Leave." I staggered back and almost fell through the window. Her scream echoed in my ears, a deafening cacophony of anguish and despair. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for the doorknob, desperate to escape the room and the relentless spirit that haunted it. I burst into the dimly lit hallway, my breath ragged, and slammed the door shut behind me. The oppressive atmosphere of the Ravenswood Inn seemed to close in around me, as if the very walls themselves held secrets too dark to fathom. Frustration and fear gnawed at us, and we decided to delve into the inn's history, hoping to unearth the source of these unsettling phenomena. We scoured local archives and interviewed longtime residents, slowly piecing together a chilling narrative. It turned out that the Ravenswood Inn had a dark past. In the 1930s, a series of unexplained deaths had occurred within its walls. Guests and staff reported apparitions, strange voices, and feelings of dread. The hotel had been abruptly closed, and the events surrounding its closure had been buried in the town's history. Our dream of restoring the inn had transformed into a waking nightmare, and the spirits that dwelled within its walls were unwilling to let us leave unscathed. The Ravenswood Inn had become a place where the past and the present converged, and the line between the living and the dead had blurred into a realm of unending horror. My friends and I had always been drawn to adventure, the kind that took us far from the comforts of city life. So, when we stumbled upon an abandoned campground during one of our hikes deep in the woods, curiosity got the better of us. We decided to make it our base camp for the weekend. Little did we know the horrors that awaited. The campground was nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense trees. It had that eerie aura of desolation, yet it felt oddly captivating. The old, dilapidated cabins stood like silent sentinels, their windows broken, and their wooden frames weathered by time. We set up our tents near a fire pit, our spirits high with excitement. As night descended upon the camp, we gathered around the flickering flames, sharing stories and laughter under the starry sky. On the first night, strange things began to happen. It started innocently enough, with the sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs in the distance. We dismiss it as the wind playing tricks on us, but that uneasy feeling refused to leave. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Our tents were filled with strange, unsettling noises that seemed to come from just beyond the fabric. We whispered to each other, trying to rationalize the eerie sounds that surrounded us. It was on the second night that things escalated. As we sat around the campfire, the flames seemed to dance with a life of their own. Shadows shifted and elongated, casting grotesque figures on the ground. We laughed nervously, dismissing our unease as mere imagination. But then, it happened, a chilling, mournful wail echoed through the night. It was a sound that sent shivers down our spines, like the anguished cry of a soul in torment. Our laughter turned to silence as we scanned the darkness, searching for the source of the haunting sound. That night, sleep was impossible. The wailing continued, growing louder and more agonized with each passing hour. It was as if the very forest mourned a long-forgotten tragedy. I watched as fear etched itself onto the faces of my friends, and a sense of dread settled over us like a suffocating blanket. Morning brought no relief. We decided to investigate the campground during daylight, hoping to uncover the source of our terror. The old cabins bore silent witness to decades of abandonment, their windows like empty eye sockets. As we explored, we found remnants of a life once lived, a children's swing set overgrown with weeds, a rusted bicycle leaning against a decaying shed, and a set of shattered porcelain dolls scattered in the underbrush. It was as if the campground had been abandoned in haste, leaving behind a trail of memories frozen in time. That evening, as we sat around the campfire once more, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Shadows danced in the periphery of our vision, and whispers seemed to emerge from the very trees themselves. Fear hung in the air like a tangible presence. As the night deepened, the wailing began anew, louder and more heart-wrenching than before. We couldn't endure another night of that mournful wailing. Fear had gripped us, and it was suffocating. We decided that leaving the abandoned campground during the night was our best option. With shaky hands, we packed our essentials, and as quietly as possible, we began our retreat. Our hearts pounded as we approached the dark trail, the chilling echoes of the wailing still haunting our thoughts. And then we saw it, a ghostly figure of a young boy standing in our path. His eyes were hollow, and his clothes were tattered. The moonlight danced eerily on his translucent form, and his mournful cries had now transformed into a sinister grin. "You can't leave," he whispered, his voice like a frigid breeze that sent shivers down our spines. Panic surged through us as we realized we were trapped between the ghostly figure and the horrors that lurked in the abandoned campground. Without a second thought, we turned and fled, seeking refuge in one of the old, decaying cabins. The air inside was damp and suffocating, filled with the scent of rot and decay. We huddled together, praying that the sinister apparition wouldn't follow us. Hours passed, and the night seemed endless. Our nerves were stretched to their limits, and exhaustion tugged at us like a heavy weight. And then the wailing started again, echoing through the forest. This time, it was closer, and it seemed to emanate from all directions. The chilling cries filled the cabin, and we covered our ears in a futile attempt to block them out. The ghostly figure of the boy materialized outside the cabin, his malevolent smile growing wider. "You can't escape," he taunted, his voice dripping with malice. The cabin door creaked open, and to our horror, the ghostly figure of the young boy stepped inside. Our hearts raced as we scrambled towards the broken windows, desperation driving us to escape the sinister presence that had invaded our refuge. With jagged glass scraping our skin, we tumbled out of the cabin and onto the forest floor. Pain was nothing compared to the terror that gripped us. As we scrambled to our feet, the ghostly boy followed, his malevolent grin never fading. Our only thought was to reach the return trail, to escape this nightmarish place and the vengeful spirit that pursued us. But as we ran, something even more horrifying began to unfold. Emerging from the shadows between the trees were more ghostly figures. They were children, their eyes vacant, their clothes tattered, and their faces twisted in eerie, otherworldly expressions. They moved with an unnatural grace, closing in around us as we desperately sought the path that would lead us back to safety. The forest had become a realm of nightmares, and we were trapped within it. Through sheer determination, we pushed forward, driven by the instinct to survive. The path to escape was ahead, illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight. We ran as if our lives depended on it. The ghostly children pursued us relentlessly, their spectral forms twisting and contorting. We could feel their cold breath on our necks, their eerie whispers filling our ears. Just as we reached the edge of the forest, we heard one final, chilling wail, more mournful and anguished than any before. It was the voice of the ghostly boy who had first confronted us. We ran until we reached the safety of our car, the nightmarish sounds of the forest fading into the distance. Our bodies were bruised and our minds scarred, but we were alive. We knew we had come face to face with something beyond our understanding, something malevolent and vengeful. We decided to research what happened at this place. Our research led us to a local historian who revealed the grim tale of the campground. Decades ago, it had been a thriving summer retreat for families. But tragedy had struck one fateful night when a fire had engulfed the cabins, claiming the lives of many children. The place had been abandoned ever since. I never thought that something as innocent as a pair of headphones would lead to the nightmare we'd soon find ourselves entangled in. It all began when our history teacher, Mr. Carson, caught my friend, Mark, wearing headphones in class. Mr. Carson was a strict teacher, known for his no-nonsense approach to education, and he promptly confiscated the headphones. As word spread through the school about Mr. Carson's headphones incident, Mark, along with our group of friends, couldn't accept the loss. Those headphones were his prized possession, a birthday gift from his parents. They were the kind that blocked out the world and enveloped you in your own musical cocoon. One night, we hatched a plan to break into the school and retrieve the headphones. We thought it would be a simple mission, a way to get back at Mr. Carson and prove that we couldn't be bossed around. Little did we know that the old school building held secrets far more terrifying than a stern teacher. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds when we met up near the school's entrance. There were 4 of us, Mark, Emma, David, and me. The group of us huddled in the shadows, our flashlight beams dancing nervously around the courtyard. The broken ground floor window seemed like our best entry point. We knew we were trespassing and that our actions could have consequences, but the allure of Mark's prized headphones, the desire to get back at Mr. Carson, and the recklessness of youth led us onward. Mark, the smallest of us, volunteered to be the first to wriggle through the window. He slipped inside and disappeared from our view, leaving us in suspense. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he reappeared, crouching in the darkness and motioning for us to follow. One by one, we squeezed through the narrow opening, landing softly on the cold, tiled floor of the school's interior. The air was musty, carrying with it the scent of old books and forgotten history. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The plan was simple: locate Mr. Carson's classroom, find the headphones, and slip back out. It should have been a quick in-and-out operation, a youthful prank meant to prove that we could outsmart our teacher. But the school had other plans for us. As we traversed the darkened hallways, our footsteps were muffled by the shroud of silence that enveloped the building. Finally, we reached Mr. Carson's classroom. Mark expertly picked the lock, a skill he'd learned from his older brother. We slipped inside, our flashlight beams revealing a room frozen in time. Mr. Carson's desk, the source of our quest, stood locked and imposing. We scoured the room, pulling open drawers and rummaging through papers, but the headphones were nowhere to be found. Mark's frustration was palpable, and the mounting tension among us was hard to ignore. Just as we considered abandoning our mission, we heard something. It was the faint laughter of children echoing through the halls. As we rushed towards the broken window, the chilling figure of the ghostly boy blocked our path. His pale, ethereal form hovered in front of us, his eyes hollow and devoid of life. His eerie, echoing laughter seemed to pierce the darkness and freeze our movements. Terror gripped our hearts as we took in the surreal sight before us. The boy's translucent figure was like something from a nightmare, a lost soul trapped in the decaying corridors of the school. The otherworldly laughter he emitted was both haunting and heart-wrenching. Emma stifled a gasp, her eyes locked onto the spectral child. David's flashlight trembled in his hand, casting erratic shadows on the boy's spectral face. Mark, still frustrated from the failed mission, was now pale and speechless. The ghostly boy's laughter transformed into an eerie whisper, a haunting murmur that seemed to come from all directions at once. He took a step towards us, and we instinctively took a step back, fear washing over us like a tidal wave. Our hearts were beating like drums in the night when the chilling apparition of the ghost boy ran towards us. Panic surged through our veins as we turned and fled, desperate to escape the haunting specter. The laughter that had once been a faint echo in the halls now seemed to envelop us, a haunting symphony of the supernatural. We raced through the dimly lit hallways, our breaths ragged and our footsteps echoing in our ears. The door to Mr. Carson's office was our only hope. We burst inside, gasping for breath, and locked the door behind us. Frantic and trembling, we searched for a way out. Our flashlights revealed a window, and we realized it was our only escape route. Mark grabbed a chair and hit the window. Shards of glass shattered and rained down onto the ground outside. Just as we were about to climb out, the door to the room creaked open slowly. The ghostly figure, a malevolent force beyond our comprehension, was still in pursuit. The echoing laughter had become a persistent, eerie whisper, a sinister reminder that we were not alone in this abandoned, haunted school. The ghostly boy lunged towards us as we scrambled to escape through the shattered window. My friends came out and it was my turn. Just as I was going out the window, his translucent, ice-cold fingers brushed against my hand, and I felt a paralyzing chill. The boy started pulling me inside. The world outside, with its moonlight and cool air, seemed to be within my grasp. With all the strength they could muster, my friends yanked me from the clutches of the ghostly figure just in the nick of time. I tumbled out of the window, leaving behind the terrifying presence of that haunted school. We didn't stop running until we had put a considerable distance between ourselves and that dreadful place. We were determined to uncover the truth about the ghostly boy. We gathered at my house, our faces pale and our voices hushed as we sifted through the information we had managed to gather. It was Emma who had stumbled upon the chilling revelation. Through a series of online searches and inquiries with the older residents of our town, she had unearthed a dark secret. Years ago, a tragic accident had occurred. A young boy, a student just like us, had met with a fatal mishap within those very walls. The details were shrouded in mystery, but it was said that he had fallen down a flight of stairs, a tumble that had claimed his life. Our youthful rebellion had led us to confront the supernatural, a horrifying experience that none of us could ever forget. The innocent quest for a pair of headphones had become a nightmarish encounter with a vengeful spirit, and it was a chilling lesson that would stay with us for the rest of our lives. The sterile hospital room was a realm of antiseptic white, its bright lights casting harsh shadows as I stood over the operating table. My hands, gloved and trembling, held the scalpel with a weight that was more than just the cold steel. The patient before me, Mr. Thomas, lay unconscious, his life hanging in the balance. I had always been a confident surgeon, but that day, fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve. Mr. Thomas had a rare condition, and this surgery was my only chance to save him. As I made the first incision, the room seemed to hold its breath. Hours passed in a haze of tension and sweat. The procedure was delicate, fraught with uncertainty. I could feel the eyes of my team on me, their trust in my skills wavering as time stretched on. My hands moved with precision, but doubt lingered in the back of my mind. And then, it happened, a mistake that would haunt me for the rest of my days. My scalpel slipped, a tiny, imperceptible error. But in the world of surgery, the smallest misstep can have catastrophic consequences. A gush of blood, a sudden drop in vital signs, and the room erupted into chaos. My heart pounded as I fought to rectify my mistake, but it was too late. Mr. Thomas slipped away, a victim of my error. The room fell into a chilling silence, broken only by the sobs of my team. I left the operating room that day a broken man, my career in tatters, my reputation shattered. The guilt weighed on me like a stone, crushing me with every step I took. Weeks turned into months, and my life spiraled into a pit of despair. The memory of Mr. Thomas haunted my every waking moment. But then, the nightmares began, vivid, torturous dreams of him, standing at the foot of my bed, his eyes filled with anger and accusation. I told myself it was just my guilt, my conscience tormenting me. But the dreams grew more vivid, more terrifying. Mr. Thomas's voice echoed in my head, a sinister whisper in the dead of night. One evening, as I sat alone in my dimly lit living room, the temperature in the room plunged. I shivered, my breath forming frosty clouds in the air. And then, I saw him, the apparition of Mr. Thomas, standing before me, his eyes burning with a malevolent rage. I gasped, stumbling back, my heart pounding in my chest. His ghostly form reached out, his fingers like icy daggers as they closed around my throat. I choked, struggling for breath, my vision darkening as his vengeance consumed me. But then, as quickly as he had appeared, Mr. Thomas was gone, leaving me gasping for air, my throat raw and bruised. I knew then that he was no ordinary spirit. He had become something darker, something more powerful, a vengeful force that would stop at nothing to make me pay for my mistake. Terrified and desperate, I began researching the paranormal, seeking a way to appease Mr. Thomas's restless soul. But with each attempt, his anger grew, his manifestations more violent. It was clear that he wanted only one thing, my life, to balance the scales of justice in the most brutal way imaginable. I became a recluse, barricading myself in my home. And so, I live in perpetual fear, knowing that my life could end at any moment, that the surgeon who had made one fatal mistake would ultimately pay the ultimate price at the hands of the vengeful spirit I had unwittingly created. I had always relished the idea of a peaceful, solitary holiday break in my college dormitory. With most of my fellow students heading home for the long holiday, I saw it as the perfect opportunity for some uninterrupted study time. Stories of strange happenings have always been told in the dormitory, but little did I know that this decision would plunge me into a chilling nightmare that I would never forget. The campus was nearly deserted as I watched my friends depart, their cheerful goodbyes fading into the distance. I was left alone in the echoing silence of our once bustling dormitory, the empty rooms and vacant hallways stretching out around me. In the beginning, the solitude was a welcome reprieve from the usual college chaos. I could study without distractions, binge-watch my favorite shows, and indulge in late-night snacks without judgment. But as the days passed, an oppressive sense of isolation began to settle over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were unseen eyes trained on me from the shadowy corners of the dormitory. The sense of dread grew with each passing day, creeping into my thoughts and dreams. One evening, as I settled into my bed, I heard a faint whisper. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, a trick of the wind or the creaking of an old building. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I rose from my bed and followed the sound, which seemed to be emanating from the hallway outside my room. The dormitory, once a place of laughter and camaraderie, now felt like a labyrinth of echoing voices, none of them human. The whispers led me to a door at the end of the hallway, a door I had never noticed before. It was old, weathered, and covered in dust, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. The whispers grew more intense, almost desperate, as I approached. With trembling hands, I turned the rusty doorknob, but the door was locked. With a little force I was able to break open the old rotten door and stepped into the room beyond. It was a small, dimly lit space filled with ancient furniture covered in dusty white sheets. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and mildew. As I ventured further into the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a collection of old photographs scattered across a cracked wooden table. They depicted college students from a bygone era, their faces frozen in time. But there was something chilling about their expressions, a mixture of fear and despair that sent shivers down my spine. As I examined the photographs, I realized that some of the faces seemed eerily familiar, like distorted reflections of my own friends and classmates. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the whispers grew louder, filling my ears with incomprehensible voices. Driven by a growing sense of dread and paranoia, I left the room. Determined to uncover the truth and put an end to the disturbing occurrences, I decided to delve deeper into the history of the dormitory. It was clear that something malevolent lurked within these walls, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I scoured the college library for any records or documents related to the dormitory's past. It took days of painstaking research, but I finally unearthed a series of old newspapers that shed light on the horrors that had unfolded here. The headlines were chilling. They spoke of a string of unexplained deaths and disappearances that had plagued the dormitory over the years. Students had gone missing, their rooms left in disarray, as if a violent struggle had taken place. Others had been found lifeless in their beds, their faces contorted in terror. The college had launched investigations, but the cases had remained unsolved, shrouded in mystery and fear. Students had spoken of hearing strange voices in the walls and seeing shadowy figures lurking in the dark corners of the dormitory. As I delved deeper into the records, I discovered an old journal written by a former student who had lived in the dormitory many years ago. His entries described a growing sense of dread and paranoia, eerily similar to what I had been experiencing. He wrote of whispers in the night, of being watched by unseen eyes, and of a room at the end of the hallway that seemed to hold a dark secret. He had ventured into that room, just as I had, and had encountered something so terrifying that he couldn't bring himself to describe it. The journal entries ended abruptly, leaving me with a sinking feeling that the author had met a gruesome fate. It was as if the malevolent presence in the dormitory had silenced him. Armed with this newfound knowledge, I was determined to confront whatever entity haunted this place. I returned to the room with the old photographs, the whispers growing louder with each step. The photographs themselves seemed to come to life, the faces contorting into grotesque expressions. I knew that the answers I sought lay within that room, but as I stepped closer to the table, a bone-chilling sensation washed over me. It was as if the malevolent force within the dormitory was warning me to stay away. Ignoring the warning, I picked up one of the photographs and studied it closely. The face in the picture seemed to shift and change, morphing into a grotesque, twisted visage. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold, clammy hand close around my wrist. I tried to pull away, but the grip was like iron. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was not alone in the room. A voice, filled with malice and hatred, spoke from the shadows. "You should not have come here," it hissed, and a sinister figure emerged from the darkness. It was a twisted, nightmarish version of a college student, their face contorted in agony and rage. The entity's grip tightened on my wrist, and I could feel its icy fingers digging into my flesh. It was as if it wanted to pull me into the darkness, to add my soul to the collection of tormented spirits that haunted this accursed place. With all the strength I could muster, I wrenched myself free and stumbled backward, my heart pounding with terror. The malevolent entity advanced, its form shifting and writhing, as if it were composed of shadows themselves. I knew I had to escape, to flee this place of unspeakable horror. As I turned and ran from the room, the whispers followed me, their voices a symphony of suffering that echoed in my ears. I burst out of the dormitory, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The malevolent presence seemed to seethe within the walls, its anger palpable, but for now, I had eluded its grasp. I never returned to that dormitory, leaving behind the nightmares and whispers that had tormented me. The malevolent entity remained trapped within its haunted domain, a place of unsolved mysteries and forgotten horrors. To this day, I can't forget the chilling experiences I endured, and I often wonder about the fate of the tormented souls who still reside within the accursed dormitory, waiting for someone else to unlock the door to their eternal torment. I had always been a skeptic, a documentary filmmaker with a penchant for exploring the unexplained and debunking the supernatural. My career had been built on exposing the tricks and illusions behind supposedly haunted houses, psychic mediums, and UFO sightings. So, when the idea of making a film about modern-day exorcisms was proposed, I saw it as an opportunity to shed light on what I believed to be nothing more than superstition and folklore. I found Father Thomas, a Catholic priest known for his specialization in performing exorcisms, through a network of contacts. He was a reserved man, with a demeanor that exuded both authority and humility. When I explained my intention to make a documentary about his work, he hesitated but eventually agreed, believing it would help demystify a practice often misunderstood by the public. As we embarked on this project, my skepticism was at an all-time high. I had seen countless exorcism documentaries and read numerous accounts of supposed demonic possessions, all of which I had dismissed as elaborate hoaxes or cases of mental illness. Father Thomas assured me that he only took on cases that had been rigorously vetted by medical professionals and subjected to exhaustive psychological evaluations. Our first exorcism was scheduled at a small, unassuming church on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect location, I thought, for capturing the reality behind these rituals. The crew and I set up our equipment discreetly, eager to record every moment of the exorcism. The young woman, Angela, who was believed to be possessed, sat in the front pew, her face a mask of fear and suffering. Her family, desperate for answers, had turned to Father Thomas as a last resort. I watched as he began the ritual, reciting prayers in Latin and sprinkling holy water. Angela's reactions were violent and unsettling, her body contorting in unnatural ways. My camera captured every grimace, every guttural utterance, and every struggle, but I remained convinced that this was a case of psychological distress. I couldn't allow myself to believe otherwise. As the weeks passed, we followed Father Thomas to more exorcisms, each one seemingly more intense than the last. Angela's case was far from unique, we discovered. There were others like her, people who claimed to be tormented by malevolent forces beyond their control. But then, something began to change. Strange occurrences started happening around us. Equipment malfunctioned for no apparent reason, batteries drained within minutes of being fully charged, and chilling, disembodied whispers were captured on our audio recordings. At first, I brushed these incidents off as technical glitches, but they became too frequent to ignore. One night, after returning from an exorcism, I began to review the footage we had captured. As I watched Angela convulsing and writhing, a shadowy figure flickered in the background of the frame, its presence undeniable. My heart raced as I rewound the footage, hoping for a logical explanation, but there was none. I shared my findings with Father Thomas and the crew, expecting them to scoff at my suggestion of the supernatural. To my surprise, Father Thomas seemed unperturbed. "There are things in this world that defy explanation," he said cryptically. As the days turned into nights and the exorcisms continued, I began to feel a growing sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer just observers, that something had latched onto us, something malevolent and vengeful. One evening, while we were packing up our equipment after an exorcism, the church's candles flickered and died out simultaneously. In the suffocating darkness, I heard a voice, low and menacing, whisper my name. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The crew and I decided to review our footage one last time, hoping to find some rational explanation for the bizarre events that had plagued us. What we discovered was beyond anything I could have imagined. In the background of nearly every exorcism, we saw shadowy figures lurking, their presence growing more pronounced with each passing ritual. They seemed to watch us, their eyes filled with malevolence, and I couldn't deny the truth any longer. We were not alone, and our skepticism had crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence. The voices in my head were relentless, an incessant whispering that gnawed at my sanity. They echoed with a malevolent intent, their words indistinct but filled with an undeniable malice. I couldn't escape them, couldn't find refuge from their torment, not even in the solitude of my own thoughts. I lay in bed that evening, bathed in the dim glow of a single bedside lamp. The events of the past weeks played over and over in my mind like a nightmarish film reel. The shadowy figures in our footage, the inexplicable malfunctions of our equipment, the chilling whispers, they all seemed to converge in a crescendo of dread. I had become a reluctant believer in the supernatural, a reality I had spent my entire career debunking. But my newfound belief was accompanied by a profound fear, a fear that I was no longer in control of my own destiny. The next day, I woke up feeling ill, my body weighed down by an oppressive fatigue. My head throbbed with a persistent ache, and a deep sense of foreboding settled over me like a shroud. The crew noticed the change in me, the pallor of my skin, and the haunted look in my eyes. I knew I couldn't continue down this path, couldn't allow whatever malevolent force that had attached itself to us to consume me completely. I called an emergency meeting with Father Thomas and the crew, my voice trembling with anxiety. "We need to end this," I pleaded, my words filled with a desperation I couldn't hide. "Whatever we've uncovered, it's too dangerous to continue." Father Thomas, once the bastion of unwavering faith and resolve, looked at me with a solemn understanding. He knew as well as I that the supernatural forces we faced were beyond our control. The crew, initially skeptical but now shaken by the mounting evidence of malevolence, agreed without hesitation. We decided to abandon the documentary, to cease all further involvement with exorcisms, and to dismantle our equipment. It was a decision that came with a heavy sense of relief, as if we were cutting ties with an insidious presence that had latched onto us. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to rebuild my life, haunted by the events I had witnessed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something malicious was still after me, that the malevolent force we had encountered hadn't truly let go. My story begins on a somber note, in the quiet, nondescript halls of Jefferson High School. We were an ordinary group of students, navigating the typical trials and tribulations of high school life. But the sudden passing of our beloved teacher, Mr. Harrison, thrust us into a world we could never have imagined. Mr. Harrison was more than a teacher, he was a mentor, a friend, and an inspiration to us all. His classes were filled with laughter, intellectual discussions, and an undeniable passion for the subjects he taught. We admired his wit, his kindness, and his unwavering support for his students. His unexpected death left a void in our lives that we couldn't fathom. Amid our grief, we discovered something that would forever change our perception of him. It began innocently enough, with the school's janitor, Mr. Jenkins, informing us that he had found a series of cryptic notes hidden in Mr. Harrison's classroom. The notes were meticulously tucked away in books, behind posters, and even beneath the floorboards. As we examined the notes, it became evident that they were not random scribblings but a trail of breadcrumbs leading us into the enigmatic world of our late teacher. The more we uncovered, the more unsettling the revelations became. The notes hinted at a hidden past, one that seemed incongruous with the man we had known. They spoke of clandestine meetings, coded messages, and references to an organization we couldn't identify. We couldn't believe our eyes. It was as if Mr. Harrison had led a double life, one that was shrouded in secrecy and darkness. Driven by curiosity and a desire to understand the truth, we embarked on a perilous journey to unravel the mysteries of Mr. Harrison's past. It was a journey that would test the limits of our courage and push us to confront the malevolent forces that lurked beneath the surface of our seemingly ordinary high school. Our first clue led us to an abandoned library deep within the heart of the town. Mr. Harrison had often encouraged us to explore the world of literature, but we had never suspected the extent of his own literary pursuits. The library was a forgotten relic, its shelves covered in dust, and its windows obscured by overgrown ivy. Amidst the decaying books, we found a journal that bore Mr. Harrison's name. Its pages were filled with cryptic symbols, diagrams, and handwritten accounts of his involvement with a secret organization known as the Esoteric Brotherhood. The entries spoke of rituals, sacrifices, and a darkness that threatened to consume him, and the mention of Jefferson High School Room 04 only deepened the mystery. Fear gripped our hearts as we realized the extent of our teacher's involvement with this malevolent group. We couldn't comprehend how someone as kind and compassionate as Mr. Harrison could be entangled in such a sinister web. With the journal in hand, we returned to Jefferson High School, determined to find Room 04 in the basement, wherever it might be. The school's basement was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows on the cracked linoleum floors. It was a place where forgotten supplies and old furniture went to rest, a stark contrast to the bustling classrooms above. As we descended deeper into the bowels of the school, we encountered locked doors and dead ends. Room numbers on the basement doors seemed to jump from 01 to 03, with no sign of room 04. Our frustration grew, but we couldn't abandon our quest, not after what we had discovered in Mr. Harrison's journal. Then, just when hope began to wane, we stumbled upon a hidden passageway concealed behind a forgotten storage shelf. As we pushed it aside, a narrow corridor revealed itself, leading us deeper into the basement's depths. It was a place that had been forgotten by time, a relic of the school's history. At the end of the corridor, we found a nondescript door, its surface marred by age and neglect. Our hearts raced as we realized that this might be room 04, the room that held the key to Mr. Harrison's secrets. With trembling hands, we pushed open the door, revealing a chamber unlike any we had ever seen. The walls were adorned with strange symbols. In the center of the room stood an ornate pedestal, upon which rested an ancient tome bound in leather and sealed with wax. As we approached the tome, our curiosity overcame our fear. With the careful precision of a surgeon, we broke the seal and opened the pages, revealing a wealth of knowledge that defied comprehension. It spoke of rituals, arcane incantations, and a pact made with a malevolent entity known as the Shadowed One. We uncovered the organization's sinister purpose, a quest for immortality through dark rituals and unholy pacts. As we emerged from the eerie room, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We retraced our steps through the dimly lit corridor, heading back towards the basement's exit. Each step was laden with a sense of foreboding, a nagging intuition that we were not alone in this subterranean labyrinth. Just as we neared the stairwell that would lead us back to the relative safety of the school's upper levels, a sudden movement in the shadows caught our collective attention. Figures, shrouded in darkness, emerged from hidden alcoves and corners. Their presence sent shivers down our spines. The figures were cloaked in long, flowing robes that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the basement. Their faces were obscured by grotesque masks, each one a twisted visage of despair and malevolence. The sight of them was like a waking nightmare, and our breath caught in our throats. Without a word, these sinister figures moved closer, their intentions veiled in an ominous silence. We were paralyzed by fear, our minds racing for a means of escape, but we were trapped in the depths of the schools. Suddenly, one of the figures raised a hand, and in that moment, we realized they held objects in their gloved fingers, objects that gleamed malevolently in the dim light. They were knives, wickedly sharp and poised to strike. Panic surged through our veins, and instinct took over. With a collective scream, we turned and ran back towards the chamber we had just exited. The footsteps of our pursuers echoed ominously behind us, growing louder with each passing second. As we sprinted back towards the chamber, our hearts pounding with terror, we spotted a small window set high in the basement wall. It was a tiny glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness that now enveloped us. Without hesitation, one of us rushed towards the window, our companions following closely behind. The window was narrow and covered in grime, but it was our only chance at escape. We could hear the echoing footsteps of the sinister figures drawing closer, their pursuit relentless. The glass was old and brittle, and it shattered with a cacophonous crash as we desperately climbed through the narrow opening, not caring about the cuts and scrapes that it left on our bodies. We emerged from the basement, gasping for breath, and found ourselves in a small, overgrown courtyard that lay hidden behind the school. The moon cast an eerie glow on the scene, illuminating the tangled vines and rusting playground equipment that had been forgotten by time. The following day, we knew we had to share our harrowing experience with someone who might be able to help us. We sought out the headmistress, Mrs. Anderson, a stern but fair woman who had known Mr. Harrison well. She listened intently as we recounted our ordeal, her expression growing graver with each word. With a sense of urgency, she agreed to accompany us to room 04. We led her to the basement, our steps heavy with trepidation, and our hearts weighed down by the burden of what we had seen. As we reached the door of room 04 and pushed it open, a collective gasp escaped our lips. The room was empty. The ornate pedestal, the ancient tome, and the cryptic symbols on the walls, all were gone without a trace. It was as if the room had never held the malevolent secrets we had encountered. Mrs. Anderson's brow furrowed with confusion and concern. She turned to us, her eyes searching for answers that even we could not provide. "Are you sure this is the room you spoke of?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. We nodded vigorously, our minds reeling with disbelief. We had seen it with our own eyes, the room teeming with darkness and malevolence. But now, it stood as empty as any other forgotten chamber in the school's basement. Mrs. Anderson left the room, clearly disturbed by the situation. We followed her, feeling a growing sense of unease. How could an entire chamber filled with ominous artifacts and sinister symbols simply vanish overnight? It defied all logic and reason. She promised to investigate further and assured us that she would contact the authorities. It was evident that something deeply unsettling was happening within the walls of Jefferson High School, something that had ensnared us in a web of darkness from which there might be no escape. As the days passed, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that the malevolence that had consumed Mr. Harrison and threatened to consume us was still lurking, biding its time in the shadows. The nightmare had only just begun, and we were left to navigate its treacherous twists and turns, clinging to the hope that somewhere, amidst the darkness, we might find a glimmer of truth and salvation. Camping had always been our escape from the chaotic urban life that seemed to swallow us whole. So, when an opportunity arose to spend a week in a remote forest area, we eagerly seized it. The promise of solitude and untouched natural beauty was irresistible. We packed our camping gear, drove deep into the wilderness, and found a perfect spot near the forest's edge. The air was crisp, the trees tall and imposing, and the sounds of nature were like a soothing symphony. Everything felt perfect, until it wasn't. The first day was a dream. We reveled in the serenity of the forest, explored the nearby riverbank, and marveled at the wildflowers that dotted the landscape. At night, we sat by the campfire, the stars overhead as bright as I had ever seen them. On the second day, things began to take an unsettling turn. As we hiked deeper into the forest, we stumbled upon a hidden campsite. It appeared abandoned, with tents and a fire pit surrounded by peculiar symbols etched into the earth. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. To our surprise, we weren't alone. A group of people emerged from the trees, dressed in tattered clothes and bearing warm smiles. They introduced themselves as fellow campers, like-minded souls who had sought refuge in the wilderness. The leader of the group, a woman named Isabella, explained that they shared the forest with those who craved solitude and simplicity. They welcomed us with open arms, offering us a place by their campfire and stories of their own journeys into the wild. At first, it all seemed harmless, even comforting. We shared stories, assisted with camp chores, and enjoyed the camaraderie of our new friends. The forest, with its beauty and tranquility, had brought us together. As the days passed, we began to notice unsettling changes in our newfound companions. Their smiles, once warm, grew strained, and their eyes lost their kindness, replaced by an eerie emptiness. Late at night, we heard whispers and caught glimpses of bizarre rituals around their campfire. It was as if a veil of normalcy had been lifted, revealing a darkness that chilled our souls. One moonless night, hidden in the shadows, we overheard whispered conversations among the campers. They spoke of a sinister ceremony, a ritual that would please their true master, the devil. Our hearts raced as the horrifying truth dawned upon us. we had unwittingly stumbled upon a cult that worshipped evil. Fear gripped us, but we knew we had to escape. The cult, once friendly, now watched our every move, their smiles concealing malevolent intentions. We were trapped, isolated in the unforgiving wilderness with no way to call for help. We decided that our only chance of survival was to slip away during one of their rituals. As the cult gathered for their midnight ceremony, we seized our opportunity. We left our campsite quietly, our hearts pounding with terror, and ventured deeper into the forest, guided only by the pale light of the moon. Hours turned into an eternity as we navigated the treacherous terrain, never daring to look back. Dawn broke on the horizon, revealing a hidden cave, a sanctuary from the cult's relentless pursuit. We entered, our breaths ragged, our bodies trembling. In the dim light, we huddled together, knowing that the cult was still out there, hunting us with unholy fervor. Just as our breathing calmed, we heard faint footsteps echoing through the forest. The cult had come in search of us, their voices carrying through the still night air. We had to make a choice: stay hidden in hope they passed us by, or venture deeper into the cave, into the unknown. We chose the latter, driven by desperation and fear. The cave's passageway led us further underground, its walls closing in as we descended into darkness. We had no idea where this subterranean journey would take us, but it was our only chance at escape. As we navigated the labyrinthine tunnels, our only source of light a dwindling flashlight. We felt as if we had entered a nightmarish underworld, far removed from the tranquil forest we had initially sought. Suddenly we stumbled upon a chamber deep within the cave. Walls were adorned with ancient, cryptic symbols, and at its center, a pit plunged into impenetrable darkness. We heard whispers, soft and sinister, rising from the pit below. Cautiously, we approached, our fear palpable in the stifling air. And then, from the depths of the pit, a chilling voice spoke, reverberating through the chamber and sending shivers down our spines. "Welcome, my lost souls," it hissed. Fear gripped us, but we refused to surrender. With trembling hands, we searched for an escape route, our eyes falling on a narrow crevice in the chamber's wall. It was our only chance. We slipped through the narrow passage, our bodies scraped and bruised. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we emerged from the cave, blinking in the blinding sunlight. Fortunately for us, the path leading to the car was in front of us. Breathing heavily, we reached our car, hidden from the cult's prying eyes. Relief washed over us as we fumbled for the keys and started the engine. The familiar purr of the car was a symphony of safety, a stark contrast to the horrors we had just escaped. Our lives had been forever changed by that harrowing experience. We had ventured into the wilderness seeking solitude and beauty, but what we had found was a nightmare beyond our darkest imaginings. And as we returned to the world we had left behind, we carried with us the knowledge that true evil could lurk in the most unsuspecting of places, waiting to ensnare the unsuspecting and the curious alike. The theater world had always been my passion, my lifeblood. But like many others in our troupe, I had witnessed the cruel ebb and flow of fortune that came with this unforgiving profession. We were a group of actors, directors, and writers, bound together by our shared love for the stage. Yet, years of dwindling audiences and unfavorable reviews had left us teetering on the brink of obscurity. It was with a desperate hope for revival that we stumbled upon the old theater, a decaying relic of the past. The Majestic Theater, as it was once called, had hosted countless performances in its heyday. But now, its once grand marquee had faded, and its crimson curtains were threadbare. The Majestic Theater had a dark reputation in our theater community. Stories of its hauntings and eerie occurrences had circulated for decades. Legends spoke of actors who had vanished mysteriously during rehearsals, their voices forever echoing in the hollow halls of the theater. Despite the ominous tales, we couldn't resist the allure of a stage that had seen so much history. We secured a lease, convinced that this decaying theater would be the stage for our triumphant comeback. As we crossed the threshold for our first rehearsal, the air inside was heavy with a palpable sense of history. Dust motes danced in the dim light, and the creaking floorboards seemed to whisper forgotten lines of plays long past. But it wasn't long before we realized that we were not alone in the majestic theater. During rehearsals, strange occurrences disrupted our performances. Lights flickered at the most dramatic moments, and props seemed to move on their own accord. One day we were just finishing our rehearsal performance. Our exhausted bodies glistened with sweat under the warm glow of the stage lights, and we exchanged triumphant smiles as we took our bows. Then, an unexpected sound filled the majestic theater, sending shockwaves through our already weary bodies. Applause, fervent and unmistakable, cascaded from the shadowy depths of the audience seats. The seats, which should have been devoid of life, seemed to contain an invisible audience, applauding our performance with boundless enthusiasm. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to my fellow actors, searching their faces for an explanation. Their wide-eyed expressions mirrored my own astonishment. We had been alone when we entered the stage, or so we thought. The applause swelled, echoing through the grand auditorium, filling the once empty seats with an unseen but undeniable presence. "Who's out there?" I called out, my voice quivering. "This isn't funny." The applause persisted, the claps growing louder and more exuberant, as if the invisible spectators reveled in our confusion and disbelief. Fear began to creep over us, replacing the initial excitement of a successful rehearsal. We knew that this was no ordinary phenomenon. The legends and tales of the majestic theater's hauntings came rushing back to haunt our thoughts. Frantically, we scanned the darkened seats, hoping to catch a glimpse of the source of the applause. But there was nothing to see, no discernible figures or apparitions in the audience. The invisible spectators continued to applaud, their fervor escalating to an unsettling crescendo. As our collective dread swelled, we decided to make a hasty exit from the stage, eager to escape the inexplicable occurrence. But as we rushed towards the backstage exit, the heavy velvet curtains that framed the stage descended, blocking our retreat. Panic set in as we grappled with the curtains, struggling to pull them aside. It was as if some unseen force was determined to keep us confined within this eerie theater. The applause continued, a relentless reminder of our captive audience. With every ounce of strength, we managed to part the curtains. Our breathing was labored, and our faces were etched with terror. We exchanged frantic glances, grappling with the unsettling reality of the situation. The majestic theater had lived up to its sinister reputation, and we had been unwilling participants in a ghostly performance of our own. The invisible audience had applauded us with an intensity that suggested their presence was no mere illusion. We continued our rehearsals, this time acknowledging the spectral audience that had become an integral part of our performances. It was a surreal experience, rehearsing and performing for an audience we could not see but whose presence we keenly felt. The majestic theater had become a bridge between the worlds of the living and the dead, a place where the love for the stage transcended the boundaries of mortality. Our comeback performance at the majestic theater would be unlike any other, a testament to the enduring power of the theater and the spirits who refused to let artistry be forgotten. The school year had barely begun when we received the news that we would have a new class teacher, Miss Turner. Her piercing gaze making us uneasy right from the start. Miss Turner was an enigma. Tall and slender with long, raven-black hair that cascaded down her back, she had an aura of authority that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Her cold, calculating eyes seemed to strip away our defenses, leaving us vulnerable in her presence. In the beginning, it was the usual routine of a new teacher, taking attendance, outlining class rules, and introducing herself. She spoke with an unsettling calmness, her voice like a whisper that sent shivers down our spines. As the days turned into weeks, we began to notice something strange. Bad things seemed to happen to students who didn't follow Miss Turner's instructions to the letter. It started innocently enough, with a student named Jake forgetting to do his homework. He received a stern reprimand from Miss Turner, who warned him of dire consequences if it happened again. The next day, Jake arrived at school with a cast on his arm, claiming he had fallen down the stairs at home. It was a simple accident, but we couldn't help but wonder if Miss Turner's warning had manifested into something more sinister. Over time, more instances like this occurred. Sarah, who had talked back to Miss Turner during class, suddenly developed a severe case of laryngitis. She couldn't speak for weeks. Then there was Mark, who had laughed when Miss Turner stumbled in the hallway. He found himself slipping on a banana peel shortly after, and the entire school erupted in laughter. It wasn't just accidents and mishaps. Rumors began to circulate that students who crossed Miss Turner often experienced a string of misfortunes. Failing grades, broken friendships, and inexplicable injuries became commonplace. We couldn't help but connect the dots, but fear silenced us. We didn't dare confront Miss Turner about it. Her chilling smile, like a predator toying with its prey, haunted our nightmares. One day, as I sat in her class, I couldn't help but notice the way Miss Turner's eyes lingered on a student named Lily. Lily had been absent for a few days, and a rumor had spread that she had criticized Miss Turner in front of her classmates. That evening, as I walked home, I spotted Lily's house engulfed in flames. Firefighters rushed to the scene, but it was too late. Lily's lifeless body was carried out on a stretcher. The whispers grew louder, and the fear that had gripped us for so long reached a breaking point. A group of us decided to investigate Miss Turner's past, hoping to find an explanation for the horrors that had befallen our classmates. What we discovered was beyond our worst nightmares. Miss Turner had a history of teaching in various schools, each one marked by strange accidents and unfortunate events. It seemed that wherever she went, a trail of misery followed. Armed with this knowledge, we confronted Miss Turner, demanding answers. She listened in silence, her expression unreadable. Then, with a chilling smile, she uttered words that sent a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't have dug so deep," she said, her voice a soft, haunting melody. "Disobedience has consequences, and you've just sealed your fate." Terrified, we fled from her presence, but it was too late. The very next day, the nightmares began. Each night, we were haunted by visions of Miss Turner, her eyes filled with malevolence, as she whispered our names in the darkness. The nightmares were relentless, and with each passing night, they grew more horrifying. It was as if Miss Turner's dark presence had invaded our very minds. We would wake up drenched in sweat, our hearts pounding in our chests, unable to shake the images of her malevolent gaze and chilling whispers. As the weeks went by, our physical and mental states deteriorated. Dark circles formed under our eyes, and we struggled to stay awake during Miss Turner's class. It was as if we were slowly being drained of our vitality, and we knew we had to find a way to break free from this nightmarish cycle. Desperation led us to explore forbidden avenues. We found a group of mystics on the internet dealing with the occult. They listened to our harrowing tale with grave expressions, and their advice sent shivers down our spines. "You have encountered a malevolent force," said one of them, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Turner has made a pact with dark entities, and she draws power from somewhere. Look for something like an altar. When you find it, you have to destroy it. The advice from the mystics weighed heavily on our minds, and we knew that confronting the source of Miss Turner's power was our only hope for escape. One fateful day, while Miss Turner was occupied with her duties at school, we decided to take action and find the altar that bound us to her malevolent influence. We gathered in secret, our hearts beating with fear and determination as we stormed into Miss Turner's house. While we were looking for the altar, a sinister whisper echoed through the hallway. It was Miss Turner's voice, laced with malevolence, taunting us from the shadows. "You can't escape me," she hissed. We froze in terror. Her sudden appearance was unexpected, and it seemed she had sensed our defiance. With dread pooling in our hearts, we knew there was no turning back now. I and one of my friends went into the basement while the others spread out around the rooms, and then in the darkest corner of the basement, we stumbled upon an ancient door, obscured by layers of dust and cobwebs. It was a door that seemed to lead to an abyss, and a sense of foreboding washed over us. This had to be it, the entrance to the altar. With trembling hands, we pushed open the door, revealing a chilling sight. The room beyond was a cavernous chamber, its walls adorned with macabre symbols and candles that flickered with an otherworldly light. In the center of the room stood an ominous altar, draped in dark robes and surrounded by strange artifacts. As we approached the altar, we could feel the oppressive energy that emanated from it. This was the source of Miss Turner's power. With unwavering resolve, we shattered the dark altar, dispelling the malevolent force that had plagued us for so long. The room seemed to quake, and the candles' flames danced wildly. A piercing shriek, the anguished cry of Miss Turner, filled the chamber, and we knew we were on the verge of victory. We stumbled out of the chamber, our bodies drained but our spirits triumphant. There was no sign of Miss Turner, she was completely gone. The nightmare that had been our lives for months was over. Miss Turner's hold on us had been broken, and we were finally free. Word of our bravery and victory spread throughout the school, and the nightmare that was Miss Turner became a distant memory. We learned that confronting our fears and defying darkness could lead to our salvation. But even as we moved on with our lives, we couldn't forget the horrors we had endured. The scars, both physical and mental, served as a constant reminder of the terrifying ordeal we had faced together. And the knowledge that malevolent forces could lurk in the most unexpected places haunted our dreams, forever altering our perception of the world.